You think you know history, dates, names, wars won and lost. But underneath all of that, beneath the textbooks and the timelines, there's another history, one that moves in silence, one that governments couldn't explain, scientists couldn't replicate, and witnesses took to their graves. We're not talking about myths. We're talking about real places, real people, and events so strange that even the most skeptical minds have paused and asked, what actually happened here? Stay with us. This is where history gets dangerous. In the quiet French countryside of the Somme Valley, beneath layers of soil and centuries of silence, archaeologists uncovered something that stopped them cold. It wasn't a tomb. It wasn't a battlefield grave. It was something far more deliberate and far more disturbing. The site at Ribemont-sur-Ancre, a small commune in northern France, had been known to locals for generations as unremarkable farmland. But in the 1960s and 70s, systematic excavations began pulling back the earth to reveal a sanctuary, an ancient Celtic ritual site unlike anything previously documented in Western Europe. What they found inside changed our understanding of the ancient world. Thousands of human bones, carefully arranged, deliberately placed. The remains belonged to hundreds of individuals, predominantly young adult males, their bodies dismembered with surgical precision after death. Heads were separated, limbs were detached at the joints. And then, with what appears to have been extraordinary intention, the bones were assembled into structured displays. Long bones stacked, skulls positioned, entire arrangements constructed like architecture, built from the dead. Archaeologists dated the site to approximately the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, a period when Celtic tribes dominated much of northern Europe, long before Roman legions pushed into Gaul. The leading scholarly interpretation is that this was a war sanctuary, a sacred space where the bodies of defeated enemies were offered to the gods of battle, their remains displayed as trophies of divine favor. It's a reasonable explanation, supported by evidence, accepted by most historians, and yet, certain details refuse to fit neatly into that framework. The precision of the dismemberment suggests not battlefield chaos, but ritual knowledge, a practiced hand familiar with the human body. Some researchers have noted that the arrangement of remains shows repeated patterns, consistent across different layers of deposits spanning what may have been decades of continued use. This wasn't a single event. This was a tradition, a living one, which raises a question that mainstream archaeology tends to sidestep. Were all of these individuals enemies, or were some of them chosen? Classical writers, Greek and Roman historians, admittedly hostile sources with their own political motivations, described Celtic priests known as Druids as practitioners of human sacrifice. They spoke of wicker structures, of ritual killings tied to harvests, to celestial calendars, to the appeasement of gods whose names we can no longer pronounce. For centuries, modern scholars dismissed much of this as Roman propaganda, a convenient narrative to justify conquest. But Ribemont-sur-Ancre exists, the bones exist, and the arrangement, so deliberate, so repeated, so clearly the product of belief rather than brutality alone, asks us to reconsider how quickly we close that door. There is also the matter of what was found alongside the bones. Weapons, iron weapons, bent and twisted, ritually killed, as historians describe it, rendered useless before being deposited. Offerings, possibly the possessions of the dead or of those who brought them here. The site shows evidence of feasting, of fire, of continued ceremonial activity long after the initial deposits were made. People returned here, repeatedly, for generations. Why does a community keep returning to a pit of bones? What were they asking for? What did they believe lived in that space between the carefully stacked remains of the dead? The site at Ribemont-sur-Ancre has been studied, catalogued, and debated for decades. Scholars have built careful, measured conclusions around it, and those conclusions may well be correct. But standing at the edge of what was uncovered there, looking at the scale of it, the intention of it, one question lingers quietly in the background. What did the people who built this place believe they were creating? Some places don't fade from history gradually. They don't decline or empty out or quietly disappear over centuries. Some places are simply gone. Here one evening, swallowed by morning. What happened at Ribemont-sur-Ancre speaks to how ancient peoples processed violence, power, and the divine. But what happened on the southern coast of ancient Greece speaks to something else entirely. The terrifying indifference of the earth itself, and the way an entire civilization can vanish so completely that for centuries, people weren't even sure it had existed at all. This is the story of Helike. In the winter of 373 BC, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese in a region known as Achaea, one of the most prosperous and celebrated cities in ancient Greece, ceased to exist in a single night. No war, no conquest, no gradual decline, just silence and water. Helike was not an obscure settlement. It was a significant city-state, the leader of the First Achaean League, a political and religious alliance of Greek cities that carried real weight in the ancient world. The city was home to a famous sanctuary dedicated to Poseidon, the god of the sea, of earthquakes, of the deep and unpredictable forces beneath the ground. Pilgrims traveled from across the Greek world to worship there. Helike minted its own coins. It had influence, history, and permanence, or so its people believed. Ancient sources, among them the geographer Strabo and the historian Diodorus Siculus, describe what happened with an almost eerie consistency. In the days before the disaster, strange things were observed. Unusual animal behavior. Rats, weasels, snakes, and centipedes reportedly fled the city in large numbers, moving inland as if something had warned them. The accounts were specific enough that later writers took them seriously, not as myth, but as recorded observation. Then, on a winter night, the earthquake came. It struck with enough force to liquefy the ground beneath the city. The earth didn't simply shake, it gave way. And in the moments that followed, the sea responded. A massive wave, what we would today recognize as a tsunami, rolled in from the Gulf of Corinth and consumed what the earthquake had left standing. By morning, Helike was beneath the water. A Spartan fleet anchored nearby reportedly lost all of its ships. An estimated 2,000 people perished, though the true number may never be known. Ancient visitors in the years that followed claimed they could look down through the water and see the ruins below the surface. Walls, streets, the outline of the city, preserved beneath the gulf like a memory the sea refused to release. For centuries, Helike existed in the ancient world the way Atlantis would later exist in the modern imagination. As a cautionary tale, a city undone by its own proximity to divine power, a reminder that even the most established civilizations rested on uncertain ground. And then, over time, even the ruins became invisible. Silt and sediment gradually buried what the water had taken. The coastline shifted. The precise location of Helike became uncertain, then unknown, then, for a long stretch of history, forgotten entirely. Medieval and Renaissance scholars who encountered ancient references to the city assumed it was legend, a literary device, the kind of dramatic story ancient writers used to illustrate moral lessons about hubris and the wrath of gods. But then archaeology intervened. In 1988, a Greek archaeologist named Dora Katsonopoulou launched a systematic search for Helike, convinced it was real and findable. Over the following years, working with teams that included researchers from the University of Chicago, the search moved inland, away from the modern coastline, following the logic that 2,000 years of geological change might have shifted the landscape considerably. In 2001, they found it, not beneath the Gulf as ancient sources had suggested, but buried beneath a coastal plain, submerged not in open water, but in a lagoon that had long since silted over and been reclaimed by the earth. The ruins were there. Pottery, Bronze Age remains, evidence of occupation stretching back far earlier than the classical period, suggesting Helike had a history far longer and deeper than the single catastrophic night that ended it. The mainstream explanation is, by now, well established. A powerful earthquake triggered by the tectonically active region beneath the Gulf of Corinth caused ground subsidence and liquefaction. The tsunami followed. The city sank, not into the open sea, but into a coastal wetland that the shifting earth had created. Geology and seismology both support this reading, and yet certain questions remain open. The ancient accounts of animals fleeing before the disaster have attracted renewed scientific interest. Modern seismologists have documented similar animal behavior before earthquakes in various parts of the world, and while no conclusive mechanism has been confirmed, the consistency of these historical accounts is difficult to entirely dismiss. Were the people of Helike aware on some level that something was wrong? And did they choose to stay? There is also the matter of the sanctuary of Poseidon, the god explicitly associated in Greek belief with earthquakes, who bore the ancient epithet Enosichthon, meaning earth shaker. The destruction of his most celebrated northern sanctuary by the very force he was said to command generated significant theological discomfort in the ancient world. Some writers read it as punishment, others as warning. A few, more quietly, seemed to read it as proof that even the gods could not protect what they claimed to own. What does it mean when the sacred ground itself disappears? Helike has been found in the most literal sense. Its coordinates are known, its destruction is understood, the science is settled, or close to it. But something about the story resists full closure. A city that was real, prosperous, and alive, gone before dawn. A site of worship to the god of earthquakes, destroyed by an earthquake. Ruins that ancient eyes could see clearly, that then vanished so completely an entire civilization doubted they had ever existed. The earth swallowed Helike without explanation or warning. What else might it be keeping? There is something about mountains that has always drawn human beings toward the divine. They rise above the ordinary world, catch the first light of morning, and vanish into cloud and silence. They feel, in some fundamental way, like places where the distance between humanity and something greater becomes thin. Helike was taken by the earth in a single night, swallowed, buried, erased. But what we turn to now was never erased. It was hidden deliberately, carefully, by a people who understood that some knowledge is too sacred or too dangerous to leave in plain sight. This is the Enigma of Cauldron, the sacred mountain of the Dacians. In the Carpathian Mountains of what is now modern Romania, there exists a landscape so layered with history and mystery that even seasoned archaeologists approach it with something resembling humility. The Dacians, a powerful and sophisticated people who inhabited this region from roughly the 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD, built one of the ancient world's most remarkable mountain civilizations here. Their capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, sat at an elevation of over 1,200 meters, surrounded by dense forest, defended by stone fortifications, and oriented, with extraordinary precision, toward the movements of the sky. But above even their capital, somewhere in these mountains, the ancient sources speak of another place entirely. Cauldron, the sacred mountain, the dwelling place of Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis is perhaps the most enigmatic figure in all of ancient European religion. The Dacians worshipped him as a god, or perhaps as a deified ancestor, or perhaps as something that resists easy categorization entirely. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded a story about Zalmoxis that has unsettled readers ever since. According to his sources, Zalmoxis had once lived among men. He built a great hall, feasted with the leading citizens, and taught them that neither he nor they would ever truly die, that they would pass instead into a place of eternal life. Then he disappeared, retreated, according to Herodotus, into an underground chamber, a cave or vault beneath the sacred mountain, where he lived in complete seclusion for 3 years. On the 4th year, he returned. The Dacians, who had mourned him as dead, received him as proof of everything he had promised. Herodotus himself was skeptical. He suggested Zalmoxis may have been a clever man, perhaps even a former slave of the philosopher Pythagoras, who used theatrical disappearance to manufacture divine credibility. It's a rational explanation, the kind of debunking that feels satisfying on the surface, but it doesn't explain everything. The Dacian belief system, from what archaeology and fragmentary ancient sources allow us to reconstruct, was built around a genuine and sophisticated theology of immortality. Their warrior class was said to approach death without fear, not as performance, but as sincere conviction. Roman sources noted, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that Dacian soldiers fought as though dying was simply a transition, not an end. Where does that kind of belief come from? What sustained it across generations, across centuries? The sacred mountain, wherever it was, appears to have been the answer. Here, the historical record becomes frustratingly thin, and the speculation begins, carefully, to open up. No ancient source precisely identifies which mountain was Kogaionon. Scholars have proposed several candidates in the southern Carpathians, with Dialul Gradishti, the hill on which Sarmizegetusa Regia itself was built, among the most frequently cited. Others point to nearby peaks whose geography matches fragments of ancient description. The honest answer is that no consensus exists. The sacred mountain may be one that has already been partially excavated, or it may be one that hasn't been touched. What has been found in the region adds texture to the mystery without resolving it. The sanctuaries at Sarmizegetusa Regia include large circular and rectangular structures whose alignment with solar and lunar events has been extensively documented. The Dacians clearly possessed advanced astronomical knowledge. Their calendar, reconstructed by modern researchers, reflects an understanding of celestial cycles that sits uncomfortably with older assumptions about the sophistication of non-Mediterranean ancient cultures. Someone designed these structures with intent, with precision, and with a cosmological framework that went far deeper than simple seasonal observation. There are also the underground spaces. Tunnels and chambers have been found in the Orshti Mountains, some clearly constructed, others more ambiguous in origin. Romanian archaeologists have worked the region for decades, and the picture that emerges is of a culture that used the landscape itself, its heights, its depths, its hidden places, as an integral part of religious practice. And then there is the gold. The Dacians possessed legendary wealth. Ancient sources describe treasuries of extraordinary scale. When the Roman Emperor Trajan finally conquered Dacia in 106 AD, after 2 brutal and costly military campaigns, the treasure he brought back to Rome was vast enough to fund the construction of Trajan's Column, Trajan's Forum, and significant portions of the city's infrastructure. Romanian historians and archaeologists believe that a significant portion of the Dacian treasury was never found by Rome, hidden deliberately in the mountains, possibly near or within the sacred spaces the Dacians most wanted to protect. There are those, serious researchers among them, who believe the sacred mountain and its hidden chambers have not yet been fully explored. That somewhere in the Carpathians, the deliberate concealment the Dacians undertook in their final days remains intact. Trajan destroyed Sarmizegetusa Regia. He dismantled its sanctuaries stone by stone, a deliberate erasure of Dacian sacred space. He took the gold he could find. But you cannot dismantle a mountain. Kogaionon, if it has been correctly identified, if its underground chambers remain unexcavated, if the Dacians truly buried what they most valued in its depths, may still be holding what was placed there nearly 2,000 years ago. What does a people hide when they know the end is coming? And what were they protecting that was worth hiding at all? The Dacians hid their most sacred things in mountains. They buried their beliefs in stone and gold and underground chambers, trusting the earth to keep what Rome could not be allowed to take. But sometimes, the sacred things that survive are not the ones hidden deepest. Sometimes they are the ones left in the most unexpected places, waiting, quietly, for someone to finally ask the right questions. In 1891, a group of peat cutters working in a bog near the small village of Gundestrup in Jutland, Denmark, pulled something extraordinary from the ground. It had been dismantled, deliberately taken apart into individual panels, and placed in a shallow depression in the peat, as though arranged for deposition rather than concealed in panic. The bog had preserved it almost perfectly. The silver was still bright. The images were still sharp. What they had found was a cauldron unlike anything else in the ancient world. The Gundestrup cauldron is, by any measure, a remarkable object. It is large, nearly 70 centimeters in diameter, and constructed from silver of unusually high purity. Its interior and exterior surfaces are covered in elaborate relief panels depicting figures, animals, rituals, and scenes whose meaning has occupied scholars for well over a century. It dates, most researchers agree, to somewhere between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, placing it squarely within the late Iron Age, the same broad world that produced the war sanctuary at Ribemont-sur-Ancre and the Dacian mountain civilizations of the Carpathians. And like those places, it refuses to give up its secrets easily. The mainstream scholarly position on the cauldron has evolved considerably since its discovery. Early researchers assumed it was Celtic in origin. Its iconography seemed to align with what was then understood of Celtic religious imagery. The antlered figure on one of the interior panels, seated cross-legged and holding a torque and a serpent, was identified as Cernunnos, a deity associated with nature, animals, and the boundary between worlds. The imagery of warriors, cauldrons, and what appears to be ritual killing seem to fit a broadly Celtic religious framework. But the more closely researchers looked, the more complicated the picture became. The silver working technique, the specific methods used to work the metal and create the relief imagery, does not match what is known of Celtic craftsmanship in Western or Central Europe. It matches, with uncomfortable precision, the traditions of Thracian silversmiths. Thrace occupied what is now Bulgaria, northern Greece, and parts of modern Turkey, a world away from the Danish bog where the cauldron was found. Some researchers have proposed the cauldron was made in the Balkans, possibly by Thracian craftsmen working to a commission, and then traveled, through trade, tribute, gift, or conquest, north and west, until it reached Jutland. How? Over what distance? In whose hands? The iconography deepens the confusion rather than resolving it. The panels show scenes that appear to blend traditions from multiple cultures, Celtic, Thracian, and possibly influences reaching even further east, toward the steppes of Central Asia or the religious imagery of the ancient Near East. The elephant depicted on one panel has no business appearing in a European Iron Age artifact. The figure being plunged headfirst into a large vessel by a giant, an image that has generated intense debate, appears to reference either ritual drowning, initiation, resurrection, or something else entirely depending on which scholarly tradition you consult. No two researchers agree on what the full sequence of panels means. No single cultural framework accounts for all of the imagery. The cauldron seems to exist at a crossroads, between cultures, between traditions, between worlds that the ancient Mediterranean would have considered entirely separate. Which brings us to the question of why it was deposited in a bog at all. Bog deposits were not accidental in the Iron Age. We know this now with considerable confidence. The practice of placing valuable objects, weapons, jewelry, cauldrons, and in some cases human beings, into bogs, lakes, and wetlands was widespread across northern Europe and appears to have been deeply intentional. The objects were often deliberately damaged before deposition, bent, broken, or in the case of the Gundestrup cauldron, carefully dismantled, as though the act of destruction was part of the offering, as though the object needed to be ritually ended before it could be given. To whom? For what purpose? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. What we can say is that whoever placed the Gundestrup cauldron in that Danish bog understood what they were depositing. This was not a burial of convenience or an emergency concealment. This was a considered act, a final one. Some researchers have speculated that the cauldron's journey from the Balkans to Jutland traces a path of cultural transmission that we have only partially mapped, that the imagery on its panels reflects a shared religious vocabulary stretching across ancient Europe, one that connected peoples we have historically treated as separate. Others have suggested the cauldron was taken as war spoils, moved north by a tribe whose identity we cannot now determine, and eventually offered to whatever powers governed the liminal space of the bog. A few voices, working at the edges of the mainstream, have proposed that the cauldron's imagery is not narrative, but instructional, that its panels encode ritual knowledge, a sequence of practices meant to be read by those who already understood the framework, invisible to outsiders. A text written not in words, but in silver and symbol. If that is true, we have been staring at the answer for over a century without the language to read it. The Gundestrup cauldron sits today in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, beautifully lit, carefully displayed, available for anyone to examine. And still, after more than 100 years of study, its full meaning remains just beyond reach. What was it made to do? What ceremony required an object of this scale and this beauty? And what did the person who placed it in that bog believe they were giving away? Some mysteries are written in silver and symbol, like the Gundestrup cauldron, encoded in objects so beautiful and so strange that we cannot look away, even when we cannot fully read them. But other mysteries are written in stone, literally, in monuments so massive, so deliberate, and so permanent that their very existence demands an explanation, and then refuses to provide one. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, in a town that today holds fewer than 100,000 people, there stand the remnants of one of the ancient world's most powerful and least understood empires. Aksum. At its height, between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries AD, the Aksumite Empire was considered one of the 4 great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It controlled trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to India, commanded the Red Sea with a naval presence that made it indispensable to the flow of global commerce, and minted its own gold coinage, a privilege in the ancient world, reserved exclusively for the most significant powers. Its kings corresponded with Roman emperors as equals. Its merchants moved ivory, gold, frankincense, and slaves across a network that stretched from the African interior to the ports of Arabia and beyond. And then, gradually, it faded. The trade routes shifted, the climate changed, the empire contracted, and the city of Aksum slowly withdrew from the stage of world history. What it left behind is extraordinary and deeply puzzling. The stele fields of Aksum are among the most dramatic archaeological landscapes in the world. These are enormous obelisks, monolithic towers of granite, some carved to resemble multi-storied buildings, complete with false doors and decorative windows, erected as funerary monuments over underground tomb complexes. The largest ever erected, now fallen and broken, would have stood over 30 meters tall and weighed an estimated 500 tons. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and raise these structures, using the technology available in the early centuries AD, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. They were built to mark the resting places of kings. And here is where the mystery begins to deepen. The underground tombs beneath the great stele have been excavated, studied, and in some cases, entered. What researchers have found is both illuminating and frustrating. The tombs are real, large, architecturally sophisticated chambers cut into the rock, accessed by descending shafts and connected by passageways. Some contain evidence of elaborate burial rituals. Some contain artifacts, pottery, remnants of offerings, objects that speak to the wealth and ceremony of Aksumite royal death. But the kings themselves are largely absent. The royal tombs of Aksum are, in the main, empty of the remains they should contain. No royal mummies, no definitively identified royal burials. For an empire that ruled for centuries, that built monuments of this scale specifically to honor its dead rulers, the absence of the kings themselves is a silence that sits heavily over the entire site. Where did they go? The mainstream explanations are reasonable and worth considering. Ancient tombs across the world have been looted, repeatedly, systematically, and early enough in history that no record of the looting survives. The transition of Aksum to Christianity in the 4th century AD under King Azana may have brought with it a reorientation of burial practices that disrupted or relocated earlier royal remains. Time, climate, and the weight of centuries do their own quiet work on organic material. All of this is plausible, some of it is likely, but it doesn't fully account for the scale of the absence, or for the other questions that linger around Aksum like smoke that won't clear. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum is, by the account of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-covered chest described in biblical tradition as containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments. The claim is not casual or recent. It is embedded in the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century Ethiopian text that draws on far older oral and written traditions, and it describes in detail how the Ark was brought from Palestine to Ethiopia by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained this claim with complete consistency for centuries. A guardian monk, and only the guardian monk, is permitted to see the object kept in the treasury chapel adjacent to the main church. No outside researcher, no foreign government, no religious authority from any other tradition has been granted access. The guardian dies in the role. His successor takes it on. This is not fringe speculation. This is the formal maintained position of one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. Whether or not one believes the Ark of the Covenant rests in Aksum, the question it raises for our purposes is pointed. What else might be held within that landscape, protected by traditions old enough to predate the written record that might otherwise explain them? Some researchers working in the broader Aksumite region have noted that the full extent of the underground tomb network has not been mapped, that the stele fields contain anomalies that suggest additional buried structures not yet excavated, that the relationship between the pre-Christian Aksumite burial tradition and the Christian sacred spaces built directly over them has created a layered landscape where the boundaries between archaeology and living faith are genuinely difficult to navigate. You cannot excavate beneath a functioning sacred site without permission, and permission in Aksum moves slowly, if it moves at all. The kings of Aksum built monuments that have endured 2,000 years. They raised towers of stone over tombs designed to last forever. They commanded an empire that the ancient world recognized as a peer among the greatest powers of its age. And yet we cannot find them. Not their remains. Not the full record of their reigns. Not the complete picture of what they believed, what they buried, or what they asked to have protected. The stone towers still stand in the Ethiopian highlands, patient and enormous, marking places whose deepest contents remain unknown. What were the kings of Aksum trying to preserve? And who, or what, is still keeping that preservation in place? The kings of Aksum left monuments that outlasted their own memory, stone towers marking tombs whose occupants have never been found. There is something profoundly unsettling about a civilization that built for permanence and then disappeared so completely from the record. But what we turn to now is different. This mystery doesn't ask where the dead went. It asks something more immediate, more visceral, and in many ways more disturbing. It asks what was done to them before they were buried. In 2004, construction workers in the city of York, in northern England, broke ground on a housing development along a quiet residential street called Driffield Terrace. What they uncovered brought the work to an immediate halt and drew archaeologists from across the country to one of the most unusual burial sites ever found in Roman Britain. 80 skeletons, all male, almost all of them headless. York, known in the Roman period as Eboracum, was one of the most important cities in Roman Britain. It served as a military headquarters, hosted several Roman emperors, and sat at the center of the northern frontier administration. It was a city of soldiers, administrators, merchants, and the full, complex machinery of imperial occupation. Its Roman-era cemeteries have been studied for generations, but nothing in York's archaeological record had prepared researchers for Driffield Terrace. The bodies were those of large, robust males, isotope analysis and bone structure suggesting men of considerable physical size and strength, many of them showing evidence of significant muscle development consistent with hard physical labor or intense physical training. Their ages ranged broadly, but the majority were young to middle-aged adults. They had been buried for the most part in an organized fashion, not scattered or dumped, but laid out with at least some degree of deliberate arrangement. And their heads, in the majority of cases, had been removed and placed elsewhere in the grave, sometimes at the feet, sometimes alongside the body, sometimes in positions that seem almost considered. The decapitation itself was, in most cases, clean. Not the ragged trauma of battlefield injury or hasty execution. Forensic analysis of the cut marks indicated sharp blades, controlled technique, and in several cases, evidence suggesting the heads were removed after death rather than as the cause of it. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone had done it before. The mainstream interpretation that emerged from years of careful analysis pointed toward one explanation above others: gladiators. The physical profile fit. The Roman period dating fit. York was large enough and significant enough to have hosted amphitheater events, and gladiators, drawn from slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals, were known to be buried in dedicated cemeteries, sometimes with the rituals and honors their profession demanded. The post-mortem decapitation in this reading may have been a final act of the arena, a ceremonial completion of the combat, or a practical measure related to the display of the defeated. It was a compelling interpretation, widely reported, largely accepted by the broader public. And then the doubts began to surface. Not every aspect of the Driffield Terrace remains fits the gladiator model comfortably. Some of the individuals showed signs of having lived well. Their diet, reconstructed through isotope analysis, suggested access to quality food inconsistent with the lives of slaves or the condemned. Several showed healed injuries that spoke to long-term survival of serious trauma, the kind of medical care that, in the Roman world, was not freely available to everyone. Some researchers have proposed alternative identifications. Soldiers, executed criminals of higher social standing, victims of a specific historical event, a purge, a massacre, a moment of political violence that the written record has not preserved. The broad time frame of the burials, spanning several centuries of Roman occupation, makes a single event explanation difficult to sustain, but it doesn't make it impossible. There is also the persistent question of the decapitation ritual itself. Decapitation burials are not unique to Driffield Terrace. They appear across Roman Britain with enough frequency to constitute a recognized archaeological phenomenon, sometimes interpreted as a response to fear of the restless dead, a practice of ensuring the deceased could not return. In some cultural traditions, the head was considered the seat of the soul, the source of identity and power. Separating the head from the body was a way of ensuring, definitively, that what had lived in that body stayed where it was put. Were the men of Driffield Terrace feared in death? Were the careful placements of their skulls an act of respect, of ritual completion, or of containment? The site has continued to yield material for analysis in the years since its discovery. Isotope studies have shown that a significant number of the individuals were not local to York. Their childhood origins, written in their bones, pointed to locations across the Roman Empire, including the Mediterranean, continental Europe, and possibly North Africa. These were men who had traveled enormous distances before ending up in a burial ground in northern England. That fact alone reframes the picture considerably. These were not simply local criminals or soldiers. They were men whose lives had carried them across the width of the Roman world before arriving, finally, at Driffield Terrace. What brought them to York? What role did they play in the machinery of empire? And what, precisely, determined that their deaths would be marked in this particular way, with this particular careful separation of head from body, in a cemetery that seems to have been used for this specific population across generations? The gladiator interpretation remains the most frequently cited. It may well be correct, in whole or in part. But the full picture of who these men were, where they came from, how they lived, and why they were buried the way they were, has not yet been assembled. 80 headless men, carefully laid in the earth of Roman York, their skulls placed beside them like objects of significance. What did the people who buried them believe they were doing? And what did they believe those careful arrangements would prevent? The men of Driffield Terrace were buried with intention, their heads placed beside them with a care that suggests belief, ritual, and a worldview we can only partially reconstruct. They were people whose inner lives remain opaque to us, separated by language, faith, and 2,000 years of silence. But the mystery we turn to now is not about what was done to people. It is about what was done to knowledge itself. Because sometimes what disappears from history is not a city, not a people, not a tomb. Sometimes what vanishes is the record, the written memory, the evidence that something existed at all. In the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now the modern country of Yemen, there once existed a kingdom of extraordinary power, sophistication, and longevity. Its name was Himyar. And for reasons that remain genuinely unclear, the documentary record it left behind is so fragmented, so selectively preserved, and so strangely incomplete that historians who specialize in the ancient Near East still debate fundamental questions about its nature, its beliefs, and the full arc of its history. Himyar emerged as a dominant power in southern Arabia around the 2nd century BC, absorbing and eventually superseding earlier South Arabian kingdoms. Among them the famous Sabaean kingdom, whose legendary queen is known to the biblical tradition as the Queen of Sheba. At its height, the Himyarite kingdom controlled the most strategically valuable real estate in the ancient world, the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, through which passed the maritime trade routes connecting the Mediterranean, East Africa, India, and the Far East. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, ivory, and gold all moved through Himyarite-controlled territory. The kingdom was rich, powerful, and deeply connected to the broader currents of ancient world history. It left behind inscriptions, thousands of them, carved in the distinctive South Arabian script, covering everything from royal decrees to property transactions to religious dedications. These inscriptions are, in many ways, the backbone of what we know about Himyar. They survive in stone, scattered across the Yemeni landscape, resistant to the forces that destroyed everything else. But the fuller record, the administrative documents, the royal histories, the religious texts, the diplomatic correspondence that a kingdom of this scale and duration would inevitably have produced, is almost entirely gone. Not incomplete, not partially surviving. Gone. The mainstream explanation begins with material reality. Southern Arabia's climate, while preserving stone beautifully, is not kind to organic materials. Papyrus, parchment, and wood deteriorate rapidly in heat and humidity. The libraries and archives of Himyar, if they existed in perishable form, may simply have been consumed by time and climate long before anyone thought to look for them. There is also the matter of history's disruptions. Himyar's final century was extraordinarily turbulent. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries AD, the kingdom became a battlefield for competing imperial and religious ambitions. The Aksumite Empire, whose missing kings we explored earlier in this journey, invaded and occupied Himyar in the early 6th century AD, installing a Christian client ruler and integrating the kingdom into its own imperial framework. A few decades later, a Sasanian-Persian intervention ended Aksumite dominance and brought Himyar into the Persian sphere. By the time the early Islamic period began in the 7th century AD, the kingdom of Himyar had effectively ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Each of those transitions carried the potential for deliberate destruction of records, the systematic erasure of a previous power's documentary legacy, a practice as old as conquest itself. But here the mystery begins to open up in more specific and more troubling directions. The religious history of Himyar is one of the most remarkable and least understood stories in the ancient world. Over the course of its history, the kingdom appears to have undergone a dramatic religious transformation, moving from a traditional South Arabian polytheism through what appears to have been a monotheistic phase centered on a deity referred to simply as Ramanan, meaning the merciful, and then into a period of intense religious contestation involving Judaism, Christianity, and the monotheistic traditions that would eventually give rise to Islam. In the early 6th century AD, a Himyarite king named Yusuf Asar Yathar, known in later sources as Du Nuwas, appears to have embraced a form of Judaism and launched a violent persecution of the Christian community in the Himyarite city of Najran, an event recorded in multiple independent sources, including Syriac, Greek, and Ethiopian texts. The massacre at Najran became a significant moment in the religious history of the ancient Near East, provoking the Aksumite intervention that ended Du Nuwas's reign. The nature and origins of Himyarite Judaism remain deeply obscure. Where did it come from? How widely was it practiced? What texts and traditions did it draw on? These questions matter enormously for understanding the religious environment in which Islam would emerge a century later. And yet the Himyarite record is precisely silent on the points where clarity would be most valuable. Some researchers have proposed that the gaps in the Himyarite record are not entirely accidental, that the religious sensitivity of the questions involved, touching as they do on the origins and early environment of Islam, on the Jewish communities of ancient Arabia, on the relationship between monotheistic traditions in the centuries before Muhammad, may have created incentives, in various historical periods, to manage what survived and what did not. This is not a comfortable suggestion. It is also not easily dismissed. What we are left with is a kingdom that ruled for centuries, controlled the trade of the ancient world, underwent one of history's most dramatic religious transformations, and produced records that have survived only in the most fragmentary and selective form. The stone inscriptions endure. The deeper record does not. Was that survival accidental? Was it the neutral result of climate and conquest and time? Or did someone at some point decide what Himyar would be allowed to remember? The disappearance of Himyar's records reminds us that history is not simply what happened. It is what survived. And survival, as we have seen across these stories, is rarely neutral. It is shaped by climate, by conquest, by the quiet decisions of those who came after. But sometimes, history does not disappear into silence. Sometimes it goes underground. Literally. Buried beneath the surface of an ordinary landscape, waiting for someone to look in the right place at the right time. In the rolling green hills of Gloucestershire in southwestern England, there is a place called Uley. It is, by any modern measure, unremarkable. A small village set into a landscape of gentle slopes and ancient hedgerows, the kind of English countryside that feels timeless in the most comfortable sense of the word. Visitors pass through without slowing down. The fields look as they have looked for generations. But beneath that quietly pastoral surface, archaeologists have uncovered something that sits in sharp contrast to the landscape above it. A layered, sacred site of extraordinary complexity, spanning nearly 1,000 years of continuous ritual use, whose full meaning remains stubbornly out of reach. The site at Uley has been known to local antiquarians since at least the 18th century, but systematic excavation beginning in the 1970s and continuing through the 1980s revealed the true depth of what lay beneath the hillside. What emerged was a sequence of occupation and ritual use, stretching from the Iron Age through the Roman period and into the early Christian era. A sacred landscape that successive cultures had not abandoned but absorbed, layering their own practices over those of their predecessors without fully erasing what came before. At the heart of the site was a Roman temple, not an unusual discovery in this part of England. The Romans built extensively across Britain, and their religious architecture survives in fragments across the landscape. But the Uley temple was unusual in several respects. It was dedicated primarily to Mercury, the Roman god of communication, travel, boundaries, and the movement between worlds, including the boundary between the living and the dead. And the volume and nature of the votive offerings found within and around it was extraordinary. Thousands of objects, animal bones in quantities suggesting sustained and large-scale sacrifice. Curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with petitions to the god, asking for justice, revenge, the recovery of stolen property, harm to enemies, buried in the ground with the deliberate intention of delivering them to the divine. Figurines, coins, objects of personal significance deposited with the focused intensity of genuine belief. The curse tablets alone are remarkable documents. They are personal in a way that formal inscriptions rarely are, written in the voices of ordinary people, farmers and merchants and wronged individuals, addressing Mercury directly with the raw language of grievance and desperate appeal. They speak to a ritual culture of considerable sophistication, one in which the boundary between the human world and the divine was understood to be crossable, negotiable, and responsive to the right approach. But it is what lay beneath the Roman temple that has generated the most sustained scholarly interest and the most unresolved questions. Pre-Roman ritual activity at the site appears to extend back into the Iron Age, with evidence suggesting that the location was recognized as sacred long before the Romans arrived and formalized it within their own religious framework. The practice of building Roman temples directly over existing sacred sites was common across Britain, a calculated act of religious absorption, converting local sacred space into Roman sacred space while retaining the power of the location itself. What the pre-Roman rituals at Uley involved precisely is more difficult to determine. The evidence is fragmentary and the interpretation contested. But the continuity of the site's sacred status across the transition from Iron Age to Roman Britain suggests that whatever made Uley significant to its earliest users was understood and respected by those who came after. And then the site transitions again. In the post-Roman period, as the imperial infrastructure collapsed and Britain entered the era historians have awkwardly termed the Dark Ages, the temple at Uley was not abandoned. It was converted. Evidence suggests the construction of an early Christian church directly on the site, the same pattern of sacred continuity that we saw with the Romans, now repeated by the new faith. The god changed. The location did not. This three-stage sequence, Iron Age sacred site, Roman temple, early Christian church, raises a question that archaeology can identify but not fully answer. What was it about this particular hillside in Gloucestershire that made it continuously sacred across 1,000 years in three distinct religious traditions? Was it purely conventional? The Roman habit of absorbing existing sacred sites, the Christian habit of doing the same? Or was there something about the place itself that each successive culture independently recognized? Some researchers have pointed to the landscape. Uley sits on high ground with commanding views, near ancient trackways that made it accessible from multiple directions. The hillside has water sources. The orientation of the structures shows some awareness of celestial alignment. These are practical factors, and they matter. But they do not fully explain the intensity of the ritual deposit found here. The sheer volume of offerings, the thousands of objects, the animal sacrifices, the lead tablets filled with the urgent private voices of people who believed someone was listening, speaks to a site that generated genuine devotion across centuries. People did not come to Uley casually. They came with need, with fear, with the kind of focused intention that only activates when a person truly believes the place they are standing in is different from ordinary ground. Why did they believe that? What had they been told? Or what had they experienced that made this hillside, in particular, the place they brought their most urgent appeals? The underground chambers have been excavated. The offerings have been cataloged. The sequence of sacred use has been documented with considerable care. And still, the quality of belief that animated this place, the specific understanding that made Uley sacred across 1,000 years, remains just beyond what the archaeology can reach. What did people know about this hill that we have forgotten? At Uley, the sacred endured. Across 1,000 years and three distinct religions, something about that Gloucestershire hillside kept drawing people back, kept compelling them to bring their offerings, their appeals, their most private fears and angers, to a place they understood as charged with something beyond the ordinary. We may never fully know what that something was, but we know the belief was real because the evidence of it is undeniable. What we turn to now is different in character, though not entirely in spirit. Because just a short distance away, in the same broad sweep of southwestern England, there is another ancient site, one that has generated its own stubborn questions, its own incomplete answers, and its own particular quality of unresolved darkness. Maiden Castle stands on the outskirts of Dorchester in Dorset, and it is, by almost any measure, one of the most extraordinary prehistoric monuments in Europe. From a distance, it appears as a series of enormous grassy ridges rising from the surrounding farmland, smooth, green, deceptively gentle in the afternoon light. But as you move closer, the true scale becomes apparent. Maiden Castle is a hill fort, an Iron Age fortification of immense complexity and ambition, its multiple concentric ramparts enclosing an interior area of roughly 47 acres. The earthworks are up to 30 meters high in places. The western entrance is a maze of overlapping banks and ditches so elaborate that a hostile force attempting to penetrate it would have been funneled, confused, and exposed to defenders at every turn. It was built to be impregnable. And then, sometime around 43 to 44 AD, the Roman Second Legion arrived. The Roman conquest of Britain under Emperor Claudius moved with characteristic efficiency through the south of the island, and Maiden Castle, the defended center of the Durotriges tribe, stood in its path. What followed has been reconstructed through archaeology, and the picture is stark. Roman artillery, ballistae capable of launching iron-tipped bolts with lethal precision, engaged the defenders from a distance before the legions moved in. The assault was organized, overwhelming, and brief. The hill fort fell. It is what was found in the aftermath, specifically in a war cemetery excavated near the eastern entrance in the 1930s by the archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler, that has occupied researchers ever since. 38 skeletons, men, women, and at least one child, buried hastily in a manner that spoke less of ceremony than of urgency. Bodies placed in shallow graves, sometimes overlapping, without the careful arrangement that characterized formal Iron Age burial practice. Many showed severe trauma, sword cuts to the skull, spear wounds, the kind of damage that told, in the language of bone, a story of violent death. One individual had a Roman ballista bolt embedded in his spine. Still there, 2,000 years later, when the excavation team carefully brushed the soil away. Wheeler interpreted the cemetery as a war grave, the hasty burial of Durotriges warriors killed in the Roman assault, interred quickly by the survivors before the Romans fully consolidated their control of the site. It was a dramatic and compelling narrative, widely accepted and widely repeated, and for decades it stood as one of the clearest archaeological illustrations of the Roman conquest of Britain. But time and more careful analysis has complicated the picture. Subsequent study of the skeletal remains has raised questions about Wheeler's interpretation that have not been fully resolved. The population in the cemetery is not exclusively young adult males, the demographic profile you would expect from a concentration of battle casualties. Women and a child are present. The trauma patterns, while consistent with violent death in some cases, are more varied than a single battle event would typically produce. Some researchers have suggested the cemetery represents not a single moment of mass death, but an accumulation of burials over a longer period, possibly predating the Roman assault. If that is correct, then what was this cemetery for? What kind of violence, or ritual, produced this particular collection of individuals, buried in this particular way, at this particular location? The pre-Roman history of Maiden Castle adds further layers of complexity. The site had been occupied and modified over an extraordinarily long period. Neolithic activity at the site dates back to around 4000 BC, making it one of the longest continuously significant locations in British prehistory. A Neolithic causewayed enclosure, a long barrow, successive phases of hill fort construction spanning centuries. Maiden Castle was not simply a military installation. It was a place of accumulated meaning, a landscape feature that generation after generation had recognized as significant and returned to, modified, and built upon. Some researchers have noted that the positioning of the war cemetery, near the eastern entrance, the most elaborately defended and symbolically charged point of the entire structure, may not have been purely practical. In Iron Age culture, boundaries and thresholds carried profound ritual significance. The entrance to a hill fort was not simply a gap in the rampart. It was a liminal space, a point of transition between the interior world and the exterior one. Burying the dead at the threshold. Was that urgency or intention? There is also the matter of several individuals in the cemetery who show evidence of decapitation, a detail that connects Maiden Castle, quietly but insistently, to the broader pattern of head removal we encountered at Driffield Terrace. The practice appears in Iron Age contexts across Britain with enough frequency to suggest a consistent cultural logic. But that logic, precisely defined, remains elusive. Were these individuals victims of the Roman assault? Ritual deposits? Something in between, a category of death and burial that our modern frameworks don't have adequate language for? Maiden Castle has been studied for nearly a century since Wheeler's excavations. The technology brought to bear on its remains has grown exponentially more sophisticated. The questions, if anything, have grown more numerous rather than fewer. The ramparts still rise from the Dorset landscape, enormous and patient, enclosing a space that has meant something to human beings for 6,000 years. What happened inside those walls that we have not yet found the evidence to understand? Maiden Castle held its dead at the threshold, at the boundary between the interior world and the exterior one, in a space that Iron Age people understood as charged with significance precisely because it stood between things. That instinct, to mark the boundaries, to place meaning at the points where one world meets another, is not unique to Britain. It runs through human culture across every continent and every era, surfacing in forms so varied and so persistent that it begins to feel less like a cultural choice and more like something fundamental to the way human beings experience the world. What we turn to now is perhaps the most dramatic expression of that instinct in the entire ancient world. A place built not at the boundary between inside and outside, but at the boundary between the human and the divine, between the living and whatever lies beyond living. In the rocky landscape of north-central Turkey, a short distance from the ancient Hittite capital of Hattusa, there is a natural rock sanctuary that has been drawing researchers, theologians, and quietly unsettled visitors for nearly 2 centuries. Its name, Yazılıkaya, means simply inscribed rock in Turkish. The name is accurate, but it barely begins to describe what is actually there. The sanctuary consists of 2 natural rock chambers, outdoor galleries formed by limestone outcroppings that rise from the surrounding landscape like the walls of a roofless cathedral. Into the surfaces of these rock walls, Hittite craftsmen carved an extraordinary procession of figures. Gods, goddesses, divine beings of various ranks and functions, arranged in formal processions that converge at the far end of the larger chamber in a central scene of divine meeting. The carvings date primarily to the 13th century BC, during the reign of the Hittite great king Tudhaliya IV, a period when the Hittite Empire was one of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East, a peer of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. There are, in total, over 90 figures carved into the rock at Yazılıkaya. Each one is identified in the Hittite cuneiform script by name. The Hittite pantheon was vast and syncretic, absorbing gods from conquered and allied cultures across Anatolia and the broader Near East. And Yazılıkaya appears to represent something close to a complete divine census. Every significant deity, given form in stone, arranged in a hierarchy that reflects the theological order of the Hittite world. The larger chamber, Chamber A, is understood by most scholars as a site of seasonal ritual, specifically associated with the Hittite New Year festival, a celebration of cosmic renewal in which the king, as the earthly representative of the divine order, participated in ceremonies that reenacted the meeting of the gods and the re-establishment of the world's proper functioning. The processions of deities carved into the walls may have served as a permanent divine audience, the gods present in effigy for ceremonies conducted before them. It is a coherent and well-supported interpretation. But it is Chamber B, smaller, narrower, more enclosed, that generates the deepest and most unresolved questions. Chamber B is different in character from the larger gallery in ways that feel immediately significant, even to a casual visitor. It is accessed through a narrow passage, creating an experience of transition and enclosure. Its carvings are fewer but more intense. A procession of 12 identical figures, moving in lockstep, whose identity and purpose remain debated. A large relief of a sword whose blade is formed from the bodies of 4 lions and whose hilt terminates in a human head. An image of such concentrated symbolic power that it has attracted interpretations ranging from a specific deity to a cosmic weapon to a symbol of royal authority over death itself. And most significantly, a large carved figure of Tărtăria IV, the king himself, depicted in the embrace of the god Sharuma, son of the storm god Teshub. The king held, protected, absorbed into the divine. Below this image there is evidence of a stone base, or plinth, suggesting that an object, or possibly a container, was placed there, permanently, in a chamber that appears to have been designed for something more than seasonal ceremony. Some researchers have proposed that Chamber B served as a royal funerary cult space, that Tărtăria IV himself was venerated here after death, his spirit or divine essence housed in the chamber in a form of ancestor worship that the Hittite royal tradition practiced for its great kings. The narrow entrance, the enclosed space, the image of the king in divine embrace. All of this would fit a space designed for communion with the royal dead. Others have gone further. The 12 identical figures have attracted particular attention. Their number, their uniformity, their forward motion suggesting not a narrative, but a cycle. Some scholars have connected them to a calendar system, to the months of the year, to a cosmological framework in which time itself was understood as a divine procession. Chamber B in this reading was not simply a funerary space, but a place where time, death, and divine order converged, where the king, in death, became part of the machinery of cosmic renewal that Chamber A celebrated in life. There are also the alignments. Researchers examining the orientation of the chambers have noted that the natural rock formation and the positioning of key carvings show awareness of solar movement, specific moments of the year when light enters the chambers at angles that illuminate particular figures. Whether this was intentional astronomical design or the fortunate result of working within a natural landscape is a question the site itself cannot answer. What is certain is that Yazılıkaya was not a casual construction. The carving of over 90 divine figures into natural rock, each one named and positioned within a precise theological order, represents an act of sustained intention, a project that required resources, knowledge, and a vision of sacred space that went far beyond simple worship. Someone designed this place with a specific purpose in mind, a purpose precise enough to determine which gods appeared, in which order, in which chamber, facing which direction. We know the names of the gods. We know the name of the king. What we do not fully know is what Yazılıkaya was ultimately built to do, and what was placed in that inner chamber, in the darkness beneath the carved embrace of a king and his god, that has not survived for us to find. Yazılıkaya was built around the idea of the body in relation to the divine. The king held in the embrace of his god, the human form elevated, absorbed, made permanent in stone. The body, in Hittite sacred thinking, was not incidental to spiritual power. It was the site of it, the meeting point between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond it. That idea, that the body, or specific parts of it, carries a power that survives the person it belonged to, appears across ancient cultures with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. We have seen it in the careful placement of skulls at Ribemont-sur-Ancre. We have seen it in the deliberate decapitations at Driffield Terrace and Maiden Castle. We have seen it in the Hittite king, carved in stone, held in divine arms for eternity. What we turn to now takes that idea and narrows it to a single, deeply strange and surprisingly widespread practice. Not the whole body, not even the head, just the hand. In 2019, archaeologists excavating the ancient Egyptian palace complex at Avaris the capital of the Hyksos rulers who governed parts of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, made a discovery that stopped the team in their tracks. In the courtyard of the palace, they found 16 right hands. Human hands, severed at the wrist, buried in 4 separate pits with a deliberate arrangement that spoke unmistakably of ceremony. The hands were large, adult male hands, most of them, and they had been placed in the ground, not discarded or scattered, but deposited with intention. The dating placed them at approximately 1600 BC, during a period when the Hyksos were consolidating their power in the Nile Delta. The excavation team's interpretation drew on textual evidence from ancient Egyptian sources that had previously seemed like rhetorical exaggeration. Egyptian military records, including inscriptions from the reign of Moses-Amur, describe soldiers presenting severed hands to their commanders in exchange for gold. A system of accounting for enemies killed in battle, a way of tallying and rewarding valor. The hand in this reading was a trophy and a currency simultaneously. The right hand specifically, because it was the hand that held the weapon. It is a coherent explanation, supported by both archaeological and textual evidence. Widely accepted. Possibly correct. And yet the full picture is considerably stranger, because avarice is not an isolated case. Severed hand deposits have now been identified across a geographic range that stretches far beyond Egypt and spans a time frame of thousands of years. A distribution so broad that it begins to suggest not a single practice with a single explanation, but a recurring human impulse whose precise meaning shifts depending on context, while something essential remains constant. In the Austrian Bronze Age site of Winklarn, excavations revealed a pit containing multiple severed hands alongside animal remains in what appeared to be a clear ritual deposit context. Not a military accounting, but something more ceremonial, more deliberate in its combination of human and animal material. The dating and cultural context were entirely distinct from the Egyptian evidence, raising the question of whether these represented independent parallel developments or some deeper shared logic. Further examples have emerged across Central Europe, in contexts ranging from Bronze Age settlements to later Iron Age sites, each one presenting variations on the same basic phenomenon. Human hands, specifically severed, deposited in ways that speak to intentional ritual rather than practical necessity. In some cases, the hands appear to have been removed peri-mortem, at or around the time of death. In others, the evidence suggests post-mortem removal, raising the immediate question of what purpose a hand served once separated from the body it had belonged to. Several interpretive frameworks have been proposed by researchers working across these different sites, and they are worth sitting with in turn. The military trophy explanation, the avarice model, works cleanly for contexts with clear warrior associations. The hand as proof of killing, as claim to reward, as physical evidence of an enemy's defeat. In cultures where warfare was a primary route to status and resources, the systematic collection of enemy body parts as evidence has parallels across the ancient world and, uncomfortably, into much more recent history. But the ritual deposit contexts, the pits, the careful arrangements, the combination with animal remains and other votive material, push beyond the military accounting model into territory that feels more theological. Here the hand is not evidence of something done, it is an offering, something given. To what, and in exchange for what, the archaeology cannot directly answer. Some researchers have explored the symbolic weight of the hand across ancient European and Near Eastern cultures more broadly. The hand was, in the most immediate and practical sense, the primary instrument of human agency, the tool of making, fighting, gesture, and touch. In religious iconography across multiple ancient traditions, divine hands appear as symbols of power, protection, and action. The hand of a god reaches into the human world. The hand of a king extends authority. If the hand of a living person concentrated agency and power, then what did that hand retain after death? What did it mean to possess it? To bury it in a sacred space, or in the courtyard of a palace, or alongside the remains of sacrificed animals? A smaller number of researchers have proposed connections to later, better documented traditions involving relics. The practice, widespread in medieval Christianity and in various other religious traditions, of preserving and venerating body parts of the holy dead as objects of concentrated spiritual power. The relic tradition is usually discussed as a medieval phenomenon, but its underlying logic, that the physical remains of a significant person retain something of that person's power or sanctity, may reach back considerably further than the medieval period. Is that what the Bronze Age deposits represent? An early, archaeologically visible version of relic veneration, the preservation of a powerful person's hand as an object of ongoing significance? Or were these the hands of enemies, not honored dead? Trophies whose deposition in sacred spaces served a purpose more like containment than commemoration? The honest answer is that the evidence, spread across multiple cultures and thousands of years, probably encompasses more than one of these possibilities. The practice of severing and depositing hands appears to have meant different things in different contexts, and yet the persistence of the practice across such a broad range of times and places suggests that something about it resonated deeply with the human beings who carried it out. There was something about the hand that ancient people, again and again, and across enormous distances, believed was worth keeping. What did they think it held? And what did they believe happened when they placed it in the ground? The severed hands of ancient Europe remind us that the most significant objects in the ancient world were not always made of gold or silver or carved in stone. Sometimes the most powerful things were simply human, pieces of people, removed and preserved and deposited with an intention we can sense but not fully read. The body as object, the body as offering, the body as something that retains meaning long after the person it belonged to has gone. But now we turn to objects that were made rather than taken. Objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, created with a level of skill and artistry that commands respect across 2,000 years of distance. Objects that were buried with the same deliberate intention as the hands, the skulls, the curse tablets, and the votive deposits we have encountered throughout this journey, and that have left behind the same fundamental question. Why here? Why like this? And why were they never reclaimed? In the flat agricultural landscape of Norfolk in eastern England, near the small town of Snettisham, a series of discoveries beginning in 1948 and continuing across decades has produced one of the most remarkable concentrations of Iron Age metalwork ever found anywhere in Europe: the Snettisham Hoards. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with ordinary work on ordinary land. A farmer plowing a field in 1948 turned up fragments of twisted metal that caught the light in an unusual way. What followed was a sequence of discoveries, some organized, some accidental, that has continued to accumulate over more than 70 years. To date, more than 12 distinct hoards have been identified at the site, containing hundreds of objects of exceptional quality and quantity. At the heart of the Snettisham discovery are the torques. A torque, sometimes spelled torque, is a rigid or twisted metal neck ring worn as a form of personal adornment and, in the Iron Age world of Britain and continental Europe, as a symbol of status, power, and identity so charged with meaning that it appears in the hands of gods, around the necks of warriors, and in the most significant ritual deposits of the period. The Gundestrup Cauldron, which we examined earlier in this journey, depicts the antlered deity, Chernonos, holding a torque, an object of divine significance in the most literal sense. The torques found at Snettisham are, by any standard, extraordinary objects. They are made from gold, silver, electrum, and bronze, some from multiple twisted strands of metal wound together with a precision that speaks to mastery of the craft. The Great Torque, the finest piece from the collection, is made from 64 strands of gold and silver wire, twisted together in 8 groups of 8, the ends finished with elaborately decorated terminals of cast gold. It weighs just under a kilogram. It is, in the assessment of specialists who have spent careers studying ancient metalwork, among the finest objects produced in prehistoric Europe, and it was buried in the ground, in a pit, in a Norfolk field, somewhere around 75 to 50 BC. The mainstream interpretation of the Snettisham Hoards has shifted and evolved over the decades since the first discoveries. Early explanations tended toward the practical. These were valuables concealed in a time of threat, perhaps during the upheavals preceding or following the Roman conquest of Britain, hidden by their owners with the intention of recovery and never reclaimed because the owners died before they could return. It is the standard crisis burial model, and it has genuine merit as an explanation for many ancient hoards found across Europe and beyond. But Snettisham resisted in several important ways. The sheer number of hoards, 12 and counting, at a single location speaks against a simple emergency concealment. One person hiding their valuables before fleeing an advancing army is plausible. 12 separate deposits, distributed across a defined area, representing objects of varying materials and types, suggests something more systematic, more sustained, more intentional than panic. The objects themselves complicate the crisis model further. Some of the torques and other pieces found at Snettisham were not finished objects. They were incomplete, unworked, in states of partial manufacture. Others were fragments, pieces broken from larger objects, mixed in with complete and exquisite items in ways that seem indifferent to the conventional logic of valuable object storage. You do not hide your finest gold torque alongside scrap metal unless the category of value you are operating with is different from simple monetary worth. What was the value being expressed here? Some researchers have proposed that Snettisham was a sacred site, a place of ritual deposition rather than practical concealment. The landscape of Norfolk in the Iron Age was associated with the territory of the Iceni tribe, whose queen Boudica would lead the famous revolt against Roman rule in approximately 60 to 61 AD. The Iceni were known, from Roman sources, to place enormous cultural and spiritual significance on torques. They appear in descriptions of Boudica herself as symbols of royal authority and divine favor. In this reading, the deposits at Snettisham were not emergency burials, but votive offerings, objects given to the earth, to the gods, to whatever powers the Iceni believed governed the land and its prosperity. The incomplete objects would fit this framework, raw material offered before it was finished, the act of giving superseding the value of the completed form. The location itself has attracted attention. Snettisham sits near the coast of the Wash, in a landscape of significant visual and possibly spiritual character. Open, exposed, oriented toward water and sky, in ways that, across many Iron Age cultures, were associated with the kinds of liminal spaces where communication with the divine was considered possible. A few researchers working with the full body of evidence have suggested that the Snettisham site may have been a sanctuary of some kind, not a temple in the Roman architectural sense, but a recognized sacred location where deposition of valuable objects was a sustained religious practice, carried out by the Iceni community over an extended period. If that is the case, then what we have found at Snettisham may represent only the portion of a larger sacred landscape that happened to survive beneath the soil of a Norfolk field. The objects recovered are remarkable, but the full extent of what was deposited here, and why this particular ground was chosen, generation after generation, as the place where the most precious things were given away, remains a question the Hoards themselves cannot fully answer. The Great Torque sits in the British Museum now, lit and labeled and available for any visitor to stand before and admire. But someone made it to be worn, not displayed. Someone valued it enough to give it to the earth rather than keep it. What did they believe the earth would do with it? And what, if anything, did they expect in return? The people of Snettisham gave their finest things to the earth. Gold twisted with extraordinary skill, objects of beauty and power placed in the ground with an intention that went beyond simple safekeeping. They trusted the land to receive what they offered, and the land kept it faithfully for 2,000 years. There is something almost respectful in that exchange, something that speaks, however distantly, to a relationship between a people and their landscape that we can recognize even if we cannot fully understand it. But the world we move into now is harder, colder. further from the familiar landscapes of Western Europe and deeper into a terrain that feels, even in description, like the edge of something. The edge of the known world, the edge of the hospitable, the edge of what human beings can endure and still call home. The Republic of Tuva sits in the very heart of Asia, a landlocked region of the Russian Federation, bordered by Mongolia to the south, lost in the immensity of the Siberian interior. It is a landscape of steppe and mountain, of bitter winters and short summers, of distances so vast and skies so wide that the human figure seems almost incidental to the geography. It is not a place that announces itself. It does not draw the casual visitor. And yet, in the valley of the Ulugkem River, this remote and unassuming landscape contains one of the largest and most disturbing ancient burial sites in the world, Aymyrlyg. The necropolis at Aymyrlyg, the name means, with appropriate gravity, place of the dead, contains thousands of burial mounds, or kurgans, distributed across a stretch of the Tuvan steppe that speaks to centuries of continuous funerary use. Excavations carried out primarily by Soviet archaeologists between the 1960s and 1980s opened hundreds of these mounds and recovered an extraordinary volume of material spanning a time frame from roughly the 7th century BC through the 2nd century AD, a period that encompasses the rise and fall of the Scythian world and the emergence of the early nomadic empires of the Eurasian steppe. What they found inside the kurgans was, in many cases, exactly what archaeologists expect from Iron Age steppe burial sites. Bodies accompanied by grave goods, weapons, jewelry, horse equipment, ceramic vessels, the material residue of lives lived in a pastoral nomadic economy of considerable sophistication. The Scythian and related cultures of the Eurasian steppe have produced some of the most exquisite goldwork in the ancient world, and Aymyrlyg, while not the richest of the steppe burial sites, fits within that broader tradition of elaborate funerary practice. But it is not the grave goods that have drawn the sustained and troubled attention of researchers. It is the bones. The skeletal remains recovered from Aymyrlyg show a pattern of trauma so consistent and so extensive that it demanded explanation from the moment the excavations began producing results. A significant proportion of the individuals buried at the site, across multiple centuries of burial activity, across different cultural phases, across both male and female individuals of varying ages, show evidence of severe interpersonal violence. Blade wounds, blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with combat, with execution, and with something that sits uncomfortably between the two. The violence documented at Aymyrlyg is not unusual in its existence. Iron Age populations across Eurasia show elevated rates of traumatic injury, and the steppe cultures in particular were organized around a warrior ethos in which combat was a central social institution. What is unusual at Aymyrlyg is the scale, the consistency, and certain specific patterns that have generated considerable debate among the researchers who have studied the assemblage most closely. A notable proportion of the trauma at Aymyrlyg appears to have been perimortem, inflicted at or immediately around the time of death. This is the expected pattern for battle casualties or executed individuals. But the distribution of injuries across the population, including women and individuals whose physical profiles do not suggest a warrior role, complicates a straightforward battle casualty interpretation. Who was fighting? Who was being killed? And who was being buried at Aymyrlyg across all those centuries of accumulated dead? Some researchers have focused on the evidence for what appears to be ritualized violence, trauma patterns that suggest not the chaos of battlefield injury, but the controlled, repeated application of force in ways consistent with execution or sacrifice. Certain individuals show injuries concentrated in specific anatomical locations, delivered with a consistency that speaks to practice rather than passion. The Scythian world, known primarily through the hostile and frequently unreliable accounts of Greek historians, most notably Herodotus, whose descriptions of Scythian customs range from the plausible to the extraordinary, was associated in ancient sources with practices of significant ritual violence. The killing of servants, horses, and possibly captives to accompany powerful individuals into death. the use of enemy skulls as drinking vessels. Practices that modern scholarship has treated with varying degrees of credulity, but which the archaeological record from sites across the steppe has, in certain cases, uncomfortably supported. At Aymyrlyg, the evidence for the killing of individuals to accompany the dead into burial has been cautiously noted by several researchers. The presence of multiple individuals in single burial contexts, the demographic profiles of those individuals, the nature of their injuries, none of this constitutes proof, and the researchers involved have been appropriately careful about the conclusions they draw. But the pattern is there, quiet and persistent, in the bone record of a necropolis that was filled over centuries by people who understood death and what surrounded it in ways we have only fragments of evidence to reconstruct. There is also the question of the children. Juvenile remains at Aymyrlyg show trauma patterns that have been among the most difficult aspects of the site for researchers to address directly. The presence of perimortem violence affecting non-adult individuals, in a burial context, across multiple phases of occupation, does not fit cleanly into any single interpretive framework. It sits in the record, documented and unresolved, awaiting a cultural context that the available evidence cannot yet fully supply. The kurgans of Aymyrlyg are still there, most of them unexcavated, rising from the Tavan steppe in their hundreds and thousands. The Soviet-era excavations opened a significant number, but left the great majority untouched. What those unexcavated mounds contain, what patterns of burial and violence and ritual they might extend, confirm, or complicate, remains unknown. A vast city of the dead, in one of the most remote landscapes on Earth, built by people whose inner lives we are only beginning to approach. What did the living believe they owed the dead at Aymyrlyg? And what did they believe the dead required to stay where they were put? The dead of Aymyrlyg were buried across centuries in the cold heart of Asia, accumulating in their thousands on the Tavan steppe, each kurgan a sealed world of violence and ritual and belief that we are only beginning to find the tools to read. What the living owed the dead in that remote landscape, what ceremonies, what offerings, what blood, remains a question the bone record raises without fully answering. But the theme it introduces does not stay in Siberia. It travels west and north and across the centuries, surfacing again and again in the archaeological record of cultures that had no direct connection to the steppe world of Aymyrlyg, but who arrived at strikingly similar places through their own independent roads. The treatment of the dead is something requiring management, requiring specific physical interventions, specific arrangements, specific precautions, appears to be one of the oldest and most persistent impulses in human history. We have already visited York once in this journey. The headless skeletons of Driffield Terrace introduced us to the Roman city of Eboracum, to the 80 decapitated males buried in a cemetery whose population and purpose have resisted clean explanation for decades. That site raised questions about gladiators, about executed criminals, about the physical profiles of men who had traveled enormous distances before ending up in a York burial ground. But Driffield Terrace is not the only place in York where the decapitated dead have been found. It is not even the most disturbing. York sits in the Vale of York in northern England, at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, a location so strategically significant that it has been continuously occupied for nearly 2,000 years. From the Roman military fortress of Eboracum through the Viking city of Jorvik to the medieval and modern city that exists today. Every era has left its layers. Every era has buried its dead. And in those burial layers, archaeologists working across York over the past several decades have uncovered a pattern of decapitation burials that extends far beyond Driffield Terrace and far beyond the Roman period. In the post-Roman and early medieval period, roughly the 5th through 10th centuries AD, decapitation burials appear in the York region with a frequency and a consistency that has drawn sustained scholarly attention. These are not the same population as the Driffield Terrace individuals. They span different centuries, different cultural contexts, different parts of the city and its surrounding landscape. And yet the practice, the deliberate removal of the head, the specific placement of the skull in relation to the body, recurs with a persistence that demands explanation. The mainstream interpretive framework for early medieval decapitation burials in Britain has been developed over decades of careful scholarship and rests on several overlapping explanations. Judicial execution is the most straightforward. Documentary sources from the Anglo-Saxon period describe decapitation as a recognized form of capital punishment, applied to criminals, traitors, and those judged to have committed offenses serious enough to warrant death. Execution cemeteries, burial sites associated with the disposal of executed individuals, often located at boundaries and liminal spaces such as crossroads, estate edges, and ancient earthworks, have been identified across England, and York's examples fit this category in certain respects. But execution alone does not account for everything observed in the York assemblage. The placement of the skulls, placed at the feet, between the legs, cradled in the arms, positioned with a deliberateness that speaks to intention rather than convenience, echoes patterns we have encountered across this entire journey. From the skulls of Ribemont-sur-Ancre, to the decapitations of Driffield Terrace, to the head removal practices documented at Maiden Castle, the careful arrangement of the severed head in relation to the body appears not as an afterthought, but as a considered act. Something was being communicated. Something was being ensured. Several researchers working in the field of early medieval burial archaeology have argued for a second explanatory framework operating alongside or beneath the judicial one: the fear of the revenant, the returning dead, the individual whose spirit, for whatever reason, was considered unlikely to stay peacefully in the ground. In early medieval belief systems across Northern Europe, certain categories of person, the executed criminal, the social outcast, the individual who died under unusual or violent circumstances, the person suspected of particular spiritual dangers, were thought to pose a risk to the living if not properly managed in burial. Decapitation in this framework was not primarily a punishment, it was a precaution. The removal and repositioning of the head was a way of disabling the dead, of ensuring that whatever animated the body in life could not reassemble itself and return. You cannot walk, the logic suggests, if your head is not where it belongs. This interpretation is supported by comparative evidence from across the early medieval world and finds echoes in later folk traditions that persisted in rural England and Northern Europe into the early modern period. The fear of the dead returning is not a marginal or eccentric belief. It is one of the most widespread and deeply rooted anxieties in human cultural history, appearing independently across cultures on every continent. At York, the two frameworks, judicial execution and apotropaic precaution, are not mutually exclusive. An executed criminal might simultaneously be considered a dangerous revenant. The act of beheading might serve both purposes at once, the legal and the spiritual collapse into a single gesture. But there are individuals in the York decapitation assemblage who do not fit either framework cleanly. Bodies with no obvious signs of the kind of violent death associated with execution. Individuals whose burial context suggests a degree of care and ceremony inconsistent with the disposal of criminals. People who appear to have been buried by those who knew them, who placed the skull with deliberation rather than indifference. Were these people feared in death despite having died peacefully? Were they members of communities that practiced decapitation burial as a standard rite for certain categories of person, regardless of the circumstances of death? The question opens onto a broader uncertainty about the inner life of early medieval communities in the north of England. Communities navigating the collapse of Roman infrastructure, the arrival of new populations from the continent, the gradual and uneven spread of Christianity over older belief systems that did not disappear overnight, but retreated into practice, blended into the new, surfaced in the burial ground when the formal record wasn't watching. York has been excavated, studied, and interpreted by some of the finest archaeologists in Britain. Its layers of occupation are among the best documented of any city in Northern Europe. And still, in its burial grounds, the decapitated dead keep turning up. Still placed with care, still arranged with intention, still keeping in the precise geometry of skull and body a secret about what the living feared, and what they felt they had to do about it. The decapitated dead of York were managed with intention, arranged, positioned, placed in the ground with a care that speaks to genuine belief about what the dead were capable of and what the living needed to do about it. That belief lived in communities navigating enormous change, layering new faith over old practice, finding ways to accommodate anxieties that neither Roman law nor Christian theology had fully resolved. The burial ground was where those anxieties surfaced most clearly, where the inner life of a culture, rarely visible in the formal record, left its most honest evidence. But the burial ground was not the only place where those inner lives expressed themselves. There were other spaces, darker ones, more deliberately hidden, spaces that were not stumbled upon by accident, but chosen, prepared, and used, sometimes for centuries, by people who understood exactly what they were doing and wanted very much to do it, away from ordinary sight. Underground. The town of Royston sits at the intersection of two ancient roads in Hertfordshire, England, the Icknield Way, one of the oldest trackways in Britain, and Ermine Street, the Roman road running north from London. It is, geographically, a place of crossing, a point where routes converge, where travelers from different directions have met for thousands of years. And beneath it, discovered entirely by accident in 1742 when a workman's pickaxe broke through the floor of a bench in the marketplace, there is a chamber. Royston Cave is a hand-carved artificial cavern cut into the chalk bedrock beneath the town, roughly bell-shaped, approximately 5 meters high and 3 meters wide at its broadest point. Its walls are covered in carvings, figures of saints, symbols, heraldic devices, scenes from Christian iconography, executed in a style that most researchers place in the medieval period, possibly the 13th or 14th century. No documentary record of the cave's construction survives. No contemporary account explains who made it, when, or why. It was simply there, sealed and forgotten beneath the marketplace, until a pickaxe found it. Royston Cave is the most famous of what researchers have come to recognize as a broader category of site. Artificial or natural underground chambers across Britain and Northern Europe that show evidence of sustained ritual or ceremonial use, often spanning multiple periods, often located at points of geographic or symbolic significance, and almost always characterized by the same fundamental quality of deliberate concealment. They were not meant to be found. The evidence recovered from these sites. And here we must speak carefully, because the category is broad and the individual sites vary considerably in their character and date, includes the kinds of material that, by now in this journey, we have learned to associate with sustained ritual activity. Votive deposits, animal bones in configurations suggesting sacrifice or structured deposition, human remains, sometimes fragmentary, sometimes deliberately placed, objects that had been intentionally damaged before being left, broken, bent, rendered permanently unusable, offered rather than stored. At some sites, the underground chambers appear to have been used continuously across the transition from pre-Christian to Christian practice. The same pattern of sacred continuity we observed at Uley, where a Roman temple was built over an Iron Age sacred site and an early Christian church was built over the temple. The underground space, in this reading, retained its sacred character regardless of the theological framework nominally in charge above ground. This is where the mainstream interpretation begins to encounter its most interesting complications. The official religious history of medieval England presents a relatively clean narrative. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity between the 6th and 7th centuries AD, the gradual Christianization of the population, the suppression of pre-Christian practice, and the eventual dominance of the Church over all aspects of religious and ceremonial life. It is a narrative with genuine historical support. And it is also, as the archaeological record makes repeatedly clear, significantly incomplete. Pre-Christian practice did not disappear on conversion. It retreated. It went underground, sometimes metaphorically, adapting and blending into the new religious framework in ways that allowed it to persist while appearing orthodox. And sometimes it appears, quite literally, underground, continuing in spaces that were hidden from ecclesiastical authority, accessible to those who knew where they were and what they were for. invisible to everyone else. The deposits found in Royston-Type sites across Britain speak to a ritual life that official records do not document. The Church kept meticulous records of what it sanctioned. It kept rather less meticulous records of what it could not see or could not stop. What was being done in these underground spaces? The carvings at Royston Cave have been interpreted as Christian devotional art, images of saints and sacred scenes created by a religious community, possibly the Knights Templar who had a presence in the area, using the cave as a private chapel or devotional space. It is a plausible interpretation, consistent with the iconography, supported by the geography, and widely accepted as the most likely explanation. But other researchers have noted that the combination of Orthodox Christian imagery with certain symbols and geometric patterns at Royston and at comparable sites does not map cleanly onto standard medieval Christian iconographic programs. Some of the symbols have parallels in traditions that predate Christianity, in the visual vocabulary of pre-Christian Northern European religion, in alchemical and hermetic traditions that circulated in medieval Europe in complicated relationship with Orthodox faith, in the kind of syncretic spiritual practice that flourished in the gaps between official theology and lived religious experience. The underground space in these traditions carried its own theological weight. The descent below the surface of the earth was not simply a practical choice. It was a movement into a different kind of space, one associated across cultures and across centuries with the underworld, with the dead, with the forces that operated below the visible surface of things. To conduct ritual underground was to conduct it closer to those forces, closer to whatever it was that people believed lived beneath. Some sites in the Royston category have yielded deposits whose dating extends back well before the medieval period, suggesting that the underground spaces themselves were recognized as significant long before the specific rituals whose evidence survives most clearly. The caves and chambers were not created for a single purpose at a single moment. They accumulated meaning the way the sites above ground accumulated layers, slowly, through repeated use, through the decisions of successive generations who came to the same underground spaces and found them still charged with whatever had drawn their predecessors there. What drew them? What quality of these underground spaces, carved from chalk or sandstone or natural rock, hidden beneath the surface of towns and fields and ancient crossroads, made them the right place for what people needed to do? And in the chambers that have not yet been found, in the spaces still sealed beneath the roads and marketplaces and fields of Britain, what deposits are still waiting in the dark? The underground spaces of Royston and its kindred sites held their secrets in darkness and chalk and deliberate concealment. Spaces chosen precisely because they sat below the visible world, closer to whatever forces people believed operated in the depths. The descent was intentional. The hiddenness was the point. And yet, for all the mystery that surrounds those medieval and pre-medieval chambers, the ritual logic that animated them, the idea that certain sacred things belong underground, that the most powerful inscriptions and offerings should be buried rather than displayed, is not a medieval invention. It is ancient, far older than the chalk caves of Hertfordshire. Old enough, in fact, to reach back to the very foundations of the civilization that would eventually give the Western world its language of law, its architecture of governance, and its model of imperial power. It reaches back to Rome. In the Roman Forum, the heart of the ancient city, the political and ceremonial center of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, there is a patch of black marble set into the ground near the Comitium, the ancient assembly place where Rome's earliest political life was conducted. It is not large. It does not announce itself. Tourists pass over it without slowing down, their attention drawn to the more dramatic ruins that surround it. But for archaeologists, historians, and those who understand what lies beneath it, this modest rectangle of dark stone is one of the most significant and most troubling spots in the entire ancient world. The Romans called it the Lapis Niger, the Black Stone. Ancient sources referred to it with a combination of reverence and unease that is itself significant. The writer Festus, drawing on earlier sources, described it as marking a place of ill omen, a locus funestus, a site of death and darkness at the very center of Roman civic life. Some ancient authors connected it to the tomb of Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, a tradition that placed the city's mythic origin, its moment of first violence and first fratricide, directly beneath the stones of its most public space. Others associated it with the death of Faustulus, the shepherd who had raised the abandoned twins Romulus and Remus. Still others described it simply as a place cursed, marked in black not for decoration, but for warning. What lay beneath the black marble, the ancient sources agreed, was something that should not be disturbed. In 1899, the archaeologist Giacomo Boni began excavating beneath the Lapis Niger, carefully removing centuries of accumulated fill to reach the layers that predated the Imperial Forum. What he found confirmed that the site was genuinely ancient, among the oldest artificially constructed features in the Roman Forum, dating to at least the 6th century BC and possibly earlier, reaching back into a period before the Republic, before the written historical record of Rome begins. Beneath the black marble, Boni uncovered a small underground shrine, a sacred precinct consisting of a tufa stone base, the remnants of what had been a truncated cone of stone, the base of what may have been an altar or a funerary marker, and, most significantly, a cippus, a stone pillar, inscribed with the oldest Latin inscription ever found. The inscription on the cippus is, to this day, only partially understood. It is written in an archaic form of Latin so early that it predates the Latin of the Republic by centuries, and several of its words have no certain translation. What can be read with reasonable confidence appears to be a sacred law, a prohibition, a warning, a statement of consequences for violation of the sanctity of the place. The word that appears most clearly and most repeatedly in scholarly transcriptions is a form of a verb associated with sacral violation, the kind of transgression that, in Roman religious law, rendered a person sacer, outside the protection of both human and divine order, killable by anyone without legal consequence. The inscription, in other words, appears to be a curse, or something very close to one, not a metaphorical curse in the modern sense, a vague wish for misfortune, but a formal, legally and religiously binding declaration that whoever violated this space would be placed beyond the boundary of the human community and subject to consequences that the inscription itself was the instrument of enacting. The question of who placed it there, and when, and in response to what, is one that the inscription itself cannot answer in its current fragmentary state. The mainstream scholarly position on the Lapis Niger has developed carefully over the centuries since Boni's excavation, and it rests on several reasonably secure foundations. The site is genuinely ancient, among the oldest monumental constructions in Rome. The inscription is genuinely a sacred law of some kind, consistent with the formulaic language of early Roman religious prohibition. The association with Romulus or another foundational figure of early Rome is likely a later mythological accretion, a story the Romans told themselves to explain the darkness and the prohibition at the center of their public space. The black marble in this reading was a later covering, placed over the archaic shrine during a period of forum renovation to mark and protect what was already understood to be sacred and ancient, and not to be touched. It is an orderly explanation, and it leaves significant things unaddressed. The choice of black stone is not incidental. In Roman symbolic language, black was the color of the underworld, of mourning, of the forces that operated outside the bright civic world of temples and assemblies and public ceremony. To mark a spot with black stone in the center of the forum was to acknowledge, publicly and permanently, that something of the underworld existed at the heart of Rome's most public space. The Romans who laid that marble knew exactly what they were saying. What were they saying it about? The underground shrine itself has features that resist the straightforward foundational hero tomb interpretation. The objects found in the fill around the cippus include ceramic fragments, miniature vessels, animal bones, the material signature of sustained ritual activity, of offerings made repeatedly over time. This was not a sealed tomb, visited once and then forgotten. It was a place where things were brought and deposited, where some form of ritual engagement with whatever the shrine represented continued across generations. Some researchers have pointed to the location, adjacent to the Comitium, the ancient assembly place, as significant beyond the merely historical. The Comitium was the site of Rome's earliest political ceremonies, its augural observations, the rituals by which Roman magistrates confirmed their authority through divine sanction. To conduct those ceremonies immediately adjacent to a place of cursing, of ill omen, of underworld association, that proximity was surely not accidental. Was the Lapis Niger a counterweight of some kind? A recognition that political power and the forces of death and transgression were permanently adjacent, that the city could only function by acknowledging, in its very center, what it was built on top of. There are voices in the scholarly literature, careful ones, working at the edges of what the evidence directly supports, who have suggested that the Lapis Niger shrine preserves traces of a ritual tradition predating the Roman Republic entirely. That beneath the Latin inscription, beneath the foundation mythology of Romulus, there is something older, a sacred site associated with the pre-Roman inhabitants of the Palatine and surrounding hills, absorbed into Roman religious practice the way so many other pre-Roman sacred sites were absorbed, given new mythology while retaining the older, darker charge that had made them significant in the first place. If that is correct, then the Lapis Niger inscription, the oldest Latin text we have, partially illegible, partially untranslatable, warning in archaic language against violation of a space associated with death and cursing at the center of Rome, may be the visible surface of a sacred history that reaches back beyond the Romans, into a religious landscape we have almost no direct evidence to reconstruct. The Forum has been excavated extensively. The Lapis Niger and its underground shrine have been studied by some of the finest classical archaeologists of the past century. The inscription has been photographed, transcribed, debated, and subjected to every analytical tool available. Several of its words remain untranslatable. The specific nature of the violation it prohibits is not entirely clear. The full identity of what, or who, the shrine was built to contain, honor, or warn about has never been definitively established. Rome built its most public space over something it marked in black and warned its citizens, in its oldest surviving written language, not to disturb. What was beneath the Forum that the founders of Rome believed was dangerous enough to require a formal curse? And what did they know about that underground space? About what had happened there, or what lived there, or what had been placed there? That the inscription was written to prevent anyone from approaching closely enough to find out. Rome built its most public space over something it marked in black and sealed with a curse in its oldest surviving language. A warning so serious, so formally constructed, that it has endured 2,500 years without losing its quality of unease. The Romans understood in ways their later admirers often forgot, that power and darkness were not opposites, that the foundations of the greatest things were laid over ground that demanded acknowledgement, propitiation, and careful management. That instinct, to build the magnificent over the dangerous, to raise the extraordinary over the sealed and the hidden, was not uniquely Roman. It runs through the ancient world like an underground current, surfacing in the sacred mountains of the Dacians, in the layered shrines of Uley, in the black stone at the center of the Forum. And it surfaces, with particular force and particular mystery, in a hill in northern Greece that spent decades looking like nothing more than a large, unremarkable mound of earth. Until 2012, when the excavation at Amphipolis changed everything. The Kasta tomb sits beneath a circular tumulus, a burial mound, near the ancient city of Amphipolis, in the region of Macedonia, in northern Greece. The mound itself is substantial, roughly 500 meters in circumference, making it the largest burial tumulus ever found in Greece. It had been known to archaeologists for decades as a significant feature of the landscape, but the full extent of what lay beneath it was not understood until a team led by Greek archaeologist Katerina Peristeri began systematic excavation in 2012 under the auspices of the Greek Ministry of Culture. What emerged over the following years, slowly, painstakingly, in the way that serious archaeology always moves, was a tomb of staggering scale and sophistication. The entrance to the tomb is flanked by two sphinxes, Large, finely carved marble figures whose original wings have been lost, but whose presence speaks immediately to a burial of the highest possible status. In the ancient Greek world, the Sphinx was a guardian of thresholds, a creature of the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. To place two of them at the entrance of a tomb was not decorative. It was a statement about who lay within and what forces were being invoked to protect them. Beyond the Sphinxes, the tomb reveals itself in stages. A long, vaulted corridor leads to a series of chambers sealed by marble walls, their construction showing a command of architectural technique that places them among the finest examples of late classical Greek building. Two caryatids, female figures serving as architectural columns, their faces bearing expressions of striking solemnity, guard the entrance to the inner chambers. The quality of the carving, the scale of the construction, the sophistication of the architectural solutions employed, all of it speaks to resources, to intention, and to a commission that came from somewhere very close to the peak of the ancient Macedonian world. The tomb dates, on current archaeological and architectural evidence, to the late 4th century BC, the period immediately following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, and that dating is where the mystery truly begins. The late 4th century BC in Macedonia was a period of concentrated and extraordinary historical significance. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, leaving behind an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India and a succession crisis of catastrophic proportions. The wars of his successors, the Diadochi, tore the Macedonian world apart over the following decades, producing a series of violent deaths among the highest ranks of the people who had surrounded Alexander throughout his campaigns. His mother Olympias, his son Alexander Thoberforv, his half-brother Philip III Aridaeus, his general and eventual successor in Egypt Ptolemy, his most trusted commanders, friends, and administrators. Someone of extraordinary importance was buried at Amphipolis in that period. The scale and quality of the tomb make this certain. But who? The excavation of the inner chambers produced human remains, fragments of bone belonging to multiple individuals, and a range of grave goods consistent with a burial of the highest status. The analysis of those remains has generated considerable scholarly debate, with researchers proposing various identifications based on the demographic profiles of the individuals represented, the nature of the grave goods, and the historical record of who died and where during the tumultuous period following Alexander's death. The most discussed candidate, in the years following the tomb's discovery, was Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, possibly his lover, whose death in 324 BC devastated Alexander so completely that he reportedly lay with the body for days before allowing it to be moved. Alexander requested divine honors for Hephaestion from the oracle at Siwa and commissioned an elaborate funeral that ancient sources describe as among the most expensive in history. The question of where Hephaestion was ultimately buried has never been definitively settled by the historical record. Other researchers have proposed different identifications: members of Alexander's immediate family, high-ranking commanders of the successor period, figures whose deaths and burial places are poorly documented in the surviving sources. The Greek archaeological authorities, for their part, have been careful to avoid premature identification, noting that the analysis of the remains and the full assessment of the grave goods is a long-term process. What is certain is that the person or persons buried at Amphipolis were considered important enough to receive a tomb of unprecedented scale, guarded by sphinxes and caryatids, sealed with multiple marble barriers, covered by the largest burial mound in Greece. And then, at some point in antiquity, the tomb was entered. Evidence of ancient intrusion, disturbance to the ceiling walls, displacement of material within the chambers, indicates that the tomb was accessed after its original closure, in a period that the excavators have not yet been able to date precisely. What was taken, if anything, is unknown. Whether the intrusion was deliberate looting or something more complex, a ritual reopening, a secondary burial, an act of political erasure, cannot be determined from the available evidence. This detail sits uncomfortably in the record, A tomb of this scale, built with this level of investment, was entered and disturbed by persons unknown in antiquity. The people who did it left no record of their identity, their purpose, or what they found. Some researchers working on the broader context of the Kasta tomb have noted that Amphipolis itself was a city of enormous strategic and symbolic significance in the Macedonian world. It controlled key routes through northern Greece, sat at the mouth of the Strymon River, and had been a focus of military and political contest for generations before the Macedonian conquest. The choice to build the largest tomb in Greece at this location, rather than at the Macedonian royal cemetery at Aige, where Alexander's father Philip II was buried in a tomb only identified definitively in 1977, raises questions that the available evidence cannot fully answer. Why Amphipolis? Why here, rather than the traditional burial ground of the Macedonian kings? Was the choice of location a statement of some kind? A political or religious declaration encoded in geography? Or was it a practical decision, reflecting the circumstances of a death that occurred far from the royal heartland in a period of violent instability? There is also the matter of the tomb's survival. The Macedonian royal cemetery at Aige was known to ancient grave robbers, and many of its tombs were looted in antiquity. The Kasta tomb, despite evidence of ancient intrusion, survived largely intact. Its structure preserved, its sphinxes and caryatids in place, its chambers holding the fragmented remains of those buried within. The enormous tumulus that covered it did its work across 2,500 years, hiding in plain sight what lay beneath. How many more structures like it remain unexcavated across the landscape of ancient Macedonia and the broader Greek world? How many burial mounds, catalogued and recorded but never opened, contain equivalents of what Amphipolis has produced? The excavation of the Kasta tomb is ongoing. New analysis of the skeletal remains continues. The debate over the identity of those buried within it has not been resolved, and may not be resolved for years, or may never be resolved to the satisfaction of all researchers. What the tomb has given us, undeniably, is a physical object of extraordinary power, a sealed world from the period immediately following one of history's most transformative lives, constructed with an ambition that speaks to loss of a very specific and very personal kind. Someone built this for a reason that went beyond conventional funerary obligation. The scale of it, the quality of it, the guardian figures at its entrance watching across 2,500 years. All of it speaks to grief, or devotion, or the need to mark a death in a way that matched the weight of what had been lost. Who was worth this? And what did the person who commissioned it believe they were protecting, or containing, beneath the largest burial mound in Greece? The Kasta tomb was built for someone whose identity we cannot confirm, a monument of grief and devotion so large it hid itself in plain sight for 2,500 years. It belongs to a world we know, at least in outline. We have the names of the people who moved through Macedonia in the decades after Alexander's death. We have their histories, fragmentary and contested as they are. We have a framework, political, biographical, geographical, within which the mystery of the tomb can be situated, even if it cannot be resolved. What we turn to now offers no such framework. No names, no histories, no written record of any kind. Only the objects themselves, and the questions they generate in such volume and with such persistence that researchers who have spent entire careers studying them still cannot agree on what they fundamentally represent. We are going further back, much further, into a world that predates writing, predates the Bronze Age, predates the civilizations whose mysteries have occupied most of this journey. A world so remote in time that the cultures who produced what we are about to examine had dissolved and been forgotten for thousands of years before the first Greek philosopher drew breath or the first Roman stone was laid. We are going back to the Vinča culture and to the figurines they left behind. Along the banks of the Danube River, near the modern city of Belgrade in Serbia, there is an archaeological site called Vinča Belo Brdo, a tell, a mound of accumulated human occupation that has been accumulating its layers since approximately 50 and 700 BC. The Vinča culture, named for this site, spread across a substantial portion of southeastern Europe, modern Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and beyond, and flourished for roughly 2,000 years, from approximately 5,500 to 4,500 BC. It is, by any measure, one of the most significant Neolithic cultures in European prehistory. Its people built substantial settlements. They worked copper, among the earliest copper-using cultures in the world. They developed what some researchers have argued constitutes a proto-writing system, a set of symbols incised on ceramic objects with a consistency that suggests systematic use rather than random decoration. They traded across wide distances. They maintained, from the evidence of their settlements and their material culture, a level of social organization and technological sophistication that sits in uncomfortable tension with older assumptions about what Neolithic European cultures were capable of. And they made figurines. Thousands of them. Across the full geographic range of the Vinča culture and across its entire temporal span, people made small ceramic figures. Human in form, but human in a way that is consistently, deliberately, and deeply strange. The Vinča figurines are not naturalistic. They do not show human beings as human beings actually appear. They show something that is human in its basic structure, bipedal, with discernible heads and bodies and limbs, but transformed in ways that are too consistent and too specific to be accidental or unskilled. The faces, in particular, are what stop people. Large, elongated, with enormous eyes rendered as almond-shaped or triangular forms, with small or absent mouths, with features that have prompted comparisons ranging from masks to alien visitations to depictions of supernatural beings. The heads are often larger in proportion to the body than human anatomy allows. Many figures appear to be wearing something, a covering, a mask, a helmet, a headdress that obscures or replaces the human face entirely. The craftsmanship is not primitive. The Vinča people knew how to make ceramic. They were capable of producing realistic forms when they chose to. The strangeness of the figurines is not a failure of skill. It is a choice. The mainstream interpretive framework for the Vinča figurines has been developed over more than a century of scholarship. The site itself was first excavated in 1908, and it rests on several interlocking proposals. The figurines are understood by most researchers as ritual objects connected to religious or ceremonial practice. The female-coded figures, and many, though not all, Vinča figurines appear to represent female individuals, have been interpreted within the broader framework of Neolithic goddess worship or fertility cult that scholars like Maria Gimbutas developed across the second half of the 20th century. The masked or transformed faces have been explained as representations of deities, spirits, or ritual practitioners, shamans or priests depicted in the performance of ceremonies that required the adoption of a non-human identity. These are coherent proposals. They fit the figurines into a recognizable interpretive context and draw on genuine comparative evidence from other Neolithic cultures. But they leave the most specific and most persistent questions unanswered. Why do the faces look like this? What specific visual tradition, what specific theology or cosmology produced a convention of depicting the human, or the divine, with these particular features? The consistency across thousands of figurines, produced over 2,000 years and across a geographic range of hundreds of kilometers, speaks to a shared and stable visual vocabulary. This was not experimentation. This was a convention. Someone established it, and it held. What were they looking at when they made these? Some researchers have approached the figurines through the lens of mask culture, the specific practice of ritual masking, in which the practitioner adopts the identity of a deity, an ancestor, or a spirit by covering the human face. In this reading, the figurines do not depict beings with non-human faces. They depict human beings wearing masks. And the mask is the important thing, not the face beneath it. The ritual power resided in the mask, in the act of becoming something other than oneself. If that is correct, then the Vinča figurines are documents of a ritual practice whose full character we cannot reconstruct. A tradition of masked ceremony and assumed divine identity that was central enough to Vinča religious life to be depicted repeatedly, consistently, and across millennia. What were the masks for? What was being invoked or embodied or communicated through them? Other researchers have focused on the symbol system found on Vinča ceramics, the set of incised marks that some scholars have argued constitutes a proto-writing system predating the earliest Mesopotamian writing by several centuries. If the Vinča symbols are indeed a form of writing, or a precursor to writing, then they represent a technological and cognitive achievement of the first order. And the figurines, bearing some of the same symbols, may be legible objects in a system we have not yet learned to read. The claim of Vinča proto-writing remains contested. Many researchers resist the identification, arguing that the symbols are decorative or functionally marking, rather than linguistically encoding. The debate has not been resolved, and may not be resolvable with the current evidence. But the possibility sits there, patient and provocative. What if the marks on the figurines mean something specific? What if each symbol is a word, a name, a ritual instruction? What if the figurines are not merely objects of worship, but objects of communication, messages addressed to beings or forces that the Vinča people believed could receive them, at the furthest edges of the interpretive landscape? And it is worth acknowledging that these edges exist, even when they reach beyond what the evidence can support. The Vinča figurines have attracted attention from researchers and writers working outside the mainstream, who have proposed connections ranging from contact with unknown advanced cultures to representations of beings that do not fit the category of human or divine, as those categories are conventionally understood. These proposals are not supported by the archaeological evidence and are not taken seriously by professional researchers in the field. But they exist because the figurines generate them. Because the faces are strange enough, consistent enough, and ancient enough that the imagination reaches for explanations that the discipline of archaeology, properly, refuses to provide without evidence. The honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know what the Vinča figurines represent with certainty. We do not know who or what they depict. We do not know the full content of the belief system that produced them. We do not know what rituals they were part of, what ceremonies they attended, what was asked of them or offered to them or communicated through them. We know they were made in enormous numbers over an enormous span of time by a culture sophisticated enough to work copper and develop systematic symbols and trade across hundreds of kilometers. We know the faces were deliberately strange. We know the strangeness was consistent, and we know that whatever the Vinča people believed, whatever cosmology, whatever understanding of the world and what moved through it, was coherent enough and stable enough to produce the same haunting, large-eyed, masked or transformed face for 2,000 unbroken years. What were they seeing? What did they believe looked back at them from the other side of whatever boundary the figurines were made to address? The Vinča figurines stare out across 7,000 years with faces that refuse to resolve into anything fully familiar. Masks or deities or transformations or something else entirely, produced with a consistency that speaks to a shared understanding we have lost the ability to access directly. What the Vinča people believed, what they saw, what they were reaching toward when they shaped those strange ceramic faces, remains at the edge of what archaeology can recover. But there is another dimension to the Vinča world, one that sits alongside the figurines and amplifies their mystery, rather than resolving it. Because the Vinča people did not only make faces, they also made marks. Systematic, repeated, deliberately incised marks on ceramic surfaces, on objects of apparent ritual significance, on the kind of small portable items that people carry with them when they want to keep something close. And in a village in Romania, in 1961, 3 of those marked objects were found in a context so strange and so specific that they have generated controversy ever since. A controversy that touches on nothing less than the question of where human writing began, and what it means for everything we think we know about the development of civilization. This is the story of the Tărtăria tablets. The village of Tărtăria sits in the Mureș River Valley in Transylvania, in central Romania, a landscape that falls within the geographic range of the Vinča cultural sphere. In 1961, the Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was excavating a Neolithic settlement at the site when his team uncovered a ritual pit. Within the pit were the burned bones of a human adult, along with a collection of objects that included figurines, a shell bracelet, and 3 small clay tablets. The tablets were uninscribed on one face and covered on the other with incised symbols, geometric shapes, animal figures, a human figure, and marks that bore a resemblance to something that stopped Vlasa immediately and sent him to his references to verify what he was seeing. The symbols on the Tărtăria tablets looked like early Sumerian pictographs. Not vaguely, not in the way that all ancient symbol systems share superficial similarities, because human beings working with similar tools on similar materials tend toward similar shapes. Specifically, in ways that researchers who examined the tablets in the decades following their discovery found difficult to explain through coincidence alone. The dating of the tablets, established through radiocarbon analysis of the associated burned bones, placed them at approximately 5300 to 5500 BC, making them, if the dating is accepted, significantly older than the earliest Sumerian writing from Mesopotamia, which dates to approximately 3400 BC. The Tărtăria tablets, in other words, appeared to predate the earliest known writing system in the world by nearly 2,000 years. The implications, if taken at face value, are extraordinary. Either writing, or something functionally equivalent to writing, was developed independently in Neolithic southeastern Europe long before it appeared in Mesopotamia. Or there was some form of contact or cultural transmission between these two regions at a period when conventional historical models suggest no such connection existed. Or the resemblances between the Tărtăria symbols and Sumerian pictographs are coincidental, the product of independent convergence rather than shared origin. None of these options is entirely comfortable. The mainstream scholarly response to the Tărtăria tablets has been careful, and, over the decades, has shifted in emphasis. Early researchers who identified the Sumerian parallels did so with genuine excitement and genuine concern about the implications. Later scholarship has tended to pull back from the most dramatic conclusions, emphasizing several important qualifications. The radiocarbon dating of the tablets themselves, as opposed to the associated bones, is not straightforward, and some researchers have questioned whether the tablets and the bones were truly contemporaneous, or whether the objects had been curated and deposited together at a later date than their manufacture. Curation of ancient objects, the keeping and eventual ritual deposition of items much older than the context in which they were buried, is well documented in Neolithic Europe, and it is possible that the Tărtăria tablets were already old when they were placed in the pit. There is also the question of whether the symbols constitute writing at all, in the functional sense, whether they encode language, represent words or concepts in a systematic way, or whether they are something else. Ownership marks, ritual symbols, counting systems, or the kind of structured but non-linguistic marking that precedes true writing without constituting it. These are legitimate qualifications. They are the kind of careful, evidence-based restraint that good scholarship requires. And yet the tablets themselves do not become less strange when the qualifications are applied. The ritual context of the deposit is significant and has not been adequately explained by any of the mainstream frameworks. The burned human bones, the figurines, the shell bracelet, the tablets, placed together in a pit in what appears to have been a deliberate and ceremonially charged act of deposition. Whatever the tablets meant to the people who placed them there, whether they were writing or symbol systems or something with no modern equivalent, they were important enough to be buried with human remains in what looks unmistakably like a ritual context. Someone treated these marked tablets as sacred objects, as things whose proper end was burial in association with the dead. Why? If the tablets were practical objects, accounting records, ownership markers, commercial documents, why bury them in a ritual pit with burned bones and figurines? The deposition context speaks to a significance that goes beyond the administrative. Whatever was marked on those tablets, it was considered powerful enough, or dangerous enough, or sacred enough to require ritual management at the end of its useful life. This brings us to the broader question of the Vinča symbol system. The full corpus of marks found across thousands of ceramic objects from the Vinča cultural sphere, of which the Tărtăria tablets represent only the most concentrated and most debated example. Researchers who have cataloged the Vinča symbols have identified a recurring set of between 50 and 60 distinct signs, used consistently across the geographic and temporal range of the culture. The consistency is too great for random decoration. The number of distinct signs is within the range typical of early writing systems. The distribution across different types of objects, some functional, some apparently ritual, suggests a system with multiple applications. Maria Gimbutas, the Lithuanian-American archaeologist whose work on old European cultures has been enormously influential and enormously controversial in roughly equal measure, argued that the Vinča symbols were part of a sacred script, a system of marks encoding religious and cosmological meaning that constituted the earliest form of writing in Europe and possibly in the world. Her interpretation situated the symbols within her broader framework of a goddess-centered old European civilization whose sophistication and symbolic complexity had been systematically underestimated by a scholarship oriented toward the Mediterranean and the Near East. Gimbutas's work has been criticized extensively, and some of her broader claims about old European religion and social organization have not held up well under subsequent scrutiny. But her documentation of the Vinča symbol system remains a foundational reference, and the core observation that the marks are too consistent, too numerous, and too widely distributed to be dismissed as decoration has not been successfully refuted. What the symbols mean, if they mean anything in the linguistic sense, remains unknown. What they were used for, what role they played in the life of the communities that produced them, is a question that the objects themselves generate without answering. There is one further dimension of the Tărtăria story that sits in the record and is rarely discussed in the broader literature. The excavator Vlasa, who found the tablets in 1961, reported that the pit containing the tablets and bones showed evidence of having been deliberately sealed after the deposit was made. The objects had not simply been placed in the ground and covered. They had been enclosed, in a way that suggested the act of sealing was itself part of the ritual, that the finality of the closure mattered, that whatever was placed in the pit was being given to the earth in a permanent and irreversible way. The burned bones, the ritual objects, the marked tablets, all of it sealed. In a tradition that, as we have seen throughout this journey, placed profound significance on what was put underground, on what was given to the earth, and to whatever forces the earth contained. 7,000 years later, a Romanian archaeologist's trowel found the seal and opened it. What did the person who closed that pit believe they were securing in the darkness beneath the Transylvanian soil? And if the symbols on those tablets do encode something, a language, a cosmology, a set of sacred knowledge specific to a world we have almost entirely lost, what were they saying that was important enough to bury with the dead? The sealed pit at Tărtăria held its secrets for 7,000 years, marked tablets and burned bones, closed with intention, given to the earth with a finality that the person who sealed it understood as permanent. Whatever knowledge those symbols encoded, whatever cosmology or sacred understanding they represented, went into the ground with the dead and did not come back out. The world those symbols belonged to was a world before armies, before empires, before the organized machinery of large-scale violence that we associate with the rise of civilization. Or so we have tended to assume. The Neolithic and early Bronze Age peoples of Europe have been imagined in the popular consciousness as fundamentally different from the warrior cultures that followed them, more communal, more peaceful, more oriented toward the earth and the agricultural rhythms that sustained them. The Tallensi Valley does not allow that assumption to stand. In the valley of the Tallensi River in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in northeastern Germany, a series of discoveries beginning in 1996 and accelerating dramatically through the 2000s and 2010s has produced evidence of an event so large, so violent, and so entirely unexpected that it has fundamentally revised what historians and archaeologists believed was possible in Bronze Age Northern Europe. The first discovery was modest. A single upper arm bone found eroding from the riverbank with a flint arrowhead still embedded in it. The bone was sent for analysis, dated to approximately 1250 BC, and filed as an isolated find. Interesting, but not extraordinary. Individual acts of violence leave individual bones, and the Bronze Age was not without conflict. But the riverbank kept eroding, and what it gave up, year after year, was not individual. It was not isolated. It was not the residue of small-scale raiding or personal violence. It was a battlefield. Systematic excavation of the Tollens Valley riverbed and banks has now recovered the remains of an estimated 5,000 individuals, most of them young adult males, most of them showing severe perimortem trauma consistent with violent death in combat. Arrowheads, spear points, blunt force injuries to skulls, blade wounds to bones, the full physical vocabulary of organized, large-scale, coordinated violence, deposited in a river valley in northern Germany in the 13th century BC. To understand why this discovery was so disorienting for the field, it is necessary to understand what was believed about Bronze Age Northern Europe before Tollens. The prevailing model of Bronze Age society in this region did not include armies. The population density was considered too low. The political organization was considered too fragmented. The logistical infrastructure for supplying and moving large groups of warriors over significant distances was considered non-existent. Small-scale raiding between neighboring communities, yes. The kind of organized large-scale battle that would produce 5,000 casualties in a single engagement, that belonged to the civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East, not to the forests and rivers of northern Germany in 1250 BC. Tollens did not fit the model, so the model had to change. The demographic analysis of the Tollens remains has been among the most illuminating aspects of the ongoing research. The individuals recovered are overwhelmingly young adult males, consistent with a warrior population assembled for combat rather than a community affected by massacre or epidemic. Isotope analysis of the bones has revealed something even more striking. A significant proportion of the individuals at Tollens were not local. Their childhood origins, encoded in the chemical signatures of their bones, pointed to locations far to the south and east, to regions of Central Europe and possibly beyond, hundreds of kilometers from the Tollens Valley. These were not neighboring communities fighting over local resources. These were men who had traveled enormous distances. Through what mechanism of recruitment, compulsion, or alliance we cannot directly determine, to fight in a valley in what is now northeastern Germany. Who organized them? Who led them? Who decided that this river crossing, in this valley, on what appears to have been a summer day in approximately 1250 BC, was worth the mobilization of thousands of men from across a significant portion of Bronze Age Europe? The mainstream interpretation that has emerged from years of careful analysis proposes that the Tollens battle was fought over a river crossing, a strategically significant point in a landscape where rivers were primary routes of movement and communication. The geography of the site supports this. The valley narrows at the point where the remains are most concentrated, creating a natural bottleneck where a defensive force could contest a crossing with maximum effect. One group was attempting to cross. Another was attempting to prevent it. The result was carnage on a scale that the participants, and the people who heard about it afterward, would have understood as catastrophic. It is a logical reconstruction. It fits the evidence and the geography. It is probably, in its broad outlines, correct. But it raises questions that the physical evidence cannot answer. What was at stake? What was worth assembling thousands of men from across Bronze Age Europe and marching them to a river in northeastern Germany? Resources? Territory? A political dispute between powers whose names we will never know. A conflict embedded in a network of Bronze Age alliance and obligation that the written record, which does not exist for this time and place, has not preserved. The Bronze Age in Europe was not isolated. The period around 1250 BC was one of extraordinary connectivity. The Late Bronze Age exchange network linked communities from Britain to the Near East in a web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural transmission whose complexity archaeologists have only recently begun to fully appreciate. Tin from Cornwall found its way to the bronze workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean. Amber from the Baltic appeared in the tombs of Mycenaean Greece. Ideas, objects, and people moved across distances that the older models of Bronze Age society considered impossible. In that context, the presence of warriors from Central Europe at a river crossing in northern Germany becomes slightly less inexplicable, though no less astonishing. These were people connected to a wider world, operating within networks of obligation and alliance that could apparently mobilize large numbers of fighters across significant distances. What those networks looked like, who held power within them, what the political geography of Bronze Age Northern Europe actually was in 1250 BC. These are questions that Tolens raises with great force and that the available evidence cannot yet fully answer. There is also the matter of what happened after the battle. The bodies at Tolens were not buried. They were not given the kind of careful funerary treatment that Bronze Age Europe, in other contexts, lavished on its dead. They were left where they fell, in the river, on the banks, in the shallow water where the fighting had been thickest. Some of the bones show evidence of post-mortem disturbance, suggesting that the bodies lay exposed long enough for scavengers to work on them before being covered by river sediment. In a world where funerary practice was elaborate, systematic, and clearly charged with deep significance, the world of the Kurgans, the world of the Snettisham Hoards, the world of the Kasta tomb, and the decorated burial mounds of Bronze Age Europe. The absence of burial at Tolens is itself a statement. Whether it reflects the aftermath of a catastrophic defeat that left no one to bury the dead, or a deliberate decision to deny the fallen the rites they would have expected, or simply the logistical impossibility of managing thousands of bodies in a remote valley with no surviving organized force to do the work, cannot be determined. But the bodies remained. The river covered them, the sediment preserved them, and 3,200 years later, an eroding riverbank began to give them back. 5,000 men from across Bronze Age Europe gathered at a river crossing in northeastern Germany and killed each other in numbers that the field had believed impossible. For what? What cause? What alliance? What political or economic or dynastic interest was worth the organization of an army on that scale? The movement of warriors from hundreds of kilometers away, the violence on a summer day in 1250 BC that left thousands of young men unburied in a German river. The names of the commanders, the nature of the dispute, the outcome of the battle. All of it is gone, swallowed by the 3,000 years of silence that preceded the first eroding bone. Somewhere in that silence is a story. A human story, specific and personal, of decisions made and alliances formed, and a conflict that mattered enormously to the people caught in it. The river kept the bones. It did not keep the reasons. What were they fighting for? The dead of the Tolens Valley were left where they fell, unburied, unclaimed, swallowed by a river that preserved them in silence for 3,000 years. Whatever they were fighting for, whatever network of obligation or alliance or ambition had drawn them from across Bronze Age Europe to a river crossing in northeastern Germany, died with them in the water and the mud. The cause evaporated. The names were never written down. Only the bones remained, and the bones do not speak in words. But the Tolens battle was a human catastrophe, terrible in scale, devastating in its human cost, but ultimately the product of human decision and human conflict. Men chose to fight. Men were organized, led, and sent to a river crossing by other men whose names we will never know. The violence was human in its origin, even if its scale exceeded what we had thought possible. What we turn to now is different in a fundamental way, because the catastrophe at the center of this story was not made by human hands. In the southern Aegean Sea, in the island group known as the Cyclades, there's a place called Santorini, a crescent of volcanic rock, the remnant of a crater whose dramatic caldera and whitewashed villages make it one of the most photographed landscapes in the modern world. Millions of visitors come to Santorini every year. They watch the sunset from Oya. They photograph the blue-domed churches. They sail into the caldera and feel, in a vague and comfortable way, the romance of the ancient world. Almost none of them are thinking about what happened here in approximately 1620 BC. The Minoan eruption of Thera, the ancient name for Santorini, was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history. The estimates of its scale vary depending on the methodology used and the evidence consulted, but the most credible assessments place it among the most powerful eruptions of the past 10,000 years, releasing energy equivalent to hundreds of thousands of nuclear weapons, ejecting an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, collapsing the center of the island into the sea, and generating tsunamis that researchers have traced across the eastern Mediterranean. Buried beneath the volcanic ash on the southern part of the island, preserved with extraordinary completeness by the same eruption that destroyed it, is the Bronze Age settlement of Akrotiri. Akrotiri is, in many ways, the most remarkable archaeological site in the Aegean. The Minoan eruption sealed it so rapidly and so completely that 3,500 years of subsequent history simply passed over it without disturbing what lay beneath. When excavations began in 1967 under the archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, what emerged from the ash was a town frozen in the moment before catastrophe. Multi-story buildings with their walls intact, frescoes of extraordinary beauty and complexity still vivid on the plaster, ceramic vessels still sitting on the floors where they had been left. The entire material culture of a sophisticated Bronze Age community preserved in a condition that sites exposed to weather and human disturbance over thousands of years cannot approach. Akrotiri itself is not the mystery, or rather it is not the particular mystery we are examining here. The mystery lies in what came after, in the settlements that should have followed the eruption, and in the puzzling, persistent, and still not fully explained pattern of collapse, abandonment, and cultural disruption that spread outward from the Theran eruption across the eastern Mediterranean world in the decades and centuries that followed. The immediate effects of the eruption are not in question. The island of Thera was largely destroyed. Any settlements on the island at the time of the eruption, Akrotiri being the primary known example, were buried or obliterated. The tsunamis generated by the caldera collapse reached the coasts of Crete, the Greek mainland, the Levant, and possibly Egypt, with sufficient force to cause significant damage to coastal settlements and harbor infrastructure. But the downstream effects, the ways in which the Theran eruption propagated through the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age Aegean, are considerably harder to trace and considerably more contested. The Minoan civilization of Crete, the dominant maritime and cultural power of the Bronze Age Aegean, entered a period of significant disruption in the decades following the eruption. The palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and other Cretan centers show destruction layers dating to the period, some clearly violent, some more ambiguous, some consistent with earthquake damage, and some with human agency. The linear A script, the still undeciphered writing system of the Minoans, disappears from the record. The palatial system that had organized Minoan economic and religious life contracts and eventually collapses, replaced by a Mycenaean Greek presence that transforms the character of Cretan culture so completely that the Minoan world effectively ends. Was the Theran eruption the cause of Minoan collapse? The question has been debated for decades, and the honest answer is that the relationship between the eruption and the subsequent disruption of Aegean civilization is more complex than a simple cause and effect model allows. The dating is part of the problem. The radiocarbon dates for the Theran eruption, which place it at approximately 1620 to 1600 BC, sit in uncomfortable tension with the archaeological dates derived from the pottery sequences and stratigraphic relationships of the affected sites, which tend to place the disruption of Minoan civilization somewhat later, in the period around 1450 BC. The gap between these two chronologies is significant enough that some researchers have argued the eruption and the Minoan collapse cannot be directly connected, because they did not occur close enough in time for the one to have caused the other. Others have pushed back, arguing that the radiocarbon dates are more reliable than the relative pottery chronology, and that the apparent gap reflects problems with the archaeological dating rather than a genuine temporal separation between eruption and collapse. The debate continues. The gap has not been resolved. But beyond the question of the Minoan collapse, there is a broader pattern of disruption in the eastern Mediterranean world of the Late Bronze Age that has attracted sustained scholarly attention and generated some of the most significant historical controversies of the past half-century. The period between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC, roughly 3 to 4 centuries after the Theran eruption, saw the collapse of virtually every major palace civilization in the eastern Mediterranean almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greek palaces were destroyed and abandoned. The Hittite Empire, at its height one of the great powers of the ancient world, collapsed with a speed that ancient sources and modern archaeologists have both struggled to explain. The Egyptian New Kingdom survived but was severely weakened. Cities across the Levantine coast were destroyed, abandoned, or dramatically reduced. The Late Bronze Age international system, the network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that had connected Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant for centuries, simply ceased to function. The conventional explanation for this collapse, the famous Late Bronze Age collapse, has shifted over the decades. Earlier scholarship emphasized the role of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of migrating groups whose attacks on Egypt and the Levant are documented in Egyptian sources. More recent scholarship has moved toward a systems collapse model in which multiple simultaneous stresses, drought, earthquake, disrupted trade, internal social pressure, and the attacks of the Sea Peoples, combined to overwhelm political and economic systems that had become too interconnected and too fragile to absorb multiple simultaneous shocks. Where the Theran eruption fits in this longer story is a question that has not been resolved. The eruption predates the collapse by several centuries, and the direct causal line between them is difficult to draw without passing through a great deal of historical complexity. But the eruption undeniably contributed to the destabilization of the Aegean world, and the Aegean world was one of the load-bearing pillars of the Late Bronze Age international system. Remove one pillar, and the structure weakens. Add enough subsequent stress, drought, migration, trade disruption, political instability, and the structure comes down. Akrotiri sits at the beginning of that sequence, a settlement preserved in the moment before everything changed, its frescoes still vivid, its streets still paved, its buildings still standing to the second floor in the darkness beneath the ash. The people who lived there left in an orderly fashion before the eruption. No human remains have been found in Akrotiri, suggesting they had warning enough to evacuate. They took their portable valuables, and they went. Where did they go? What did they build next? What did they carry with them of the world the eruption was about to erase? The ash preserved Akrotiri. It preserved the rooms, the frescoes, the vessels on the floors. It did not preserve the people, or the knowledge they carried with them when they walked away from the town that the volcano was about to swallow. What did the survivors of Akrotiri know about what was coming? And what did they take with them that we have not yet found? The survivors of Akrotiri walked away from their town carrying what they could: their knowledge, their portable valuables, the accumulated understanding of a maritime civilization at the height of its sophistication, and disappeared into a Bronze Age world that was itself beginning to tremble at its foundations. The eruption that buried their homes in ash would send ripples across the eastern Mediterranean for generations. What those people built next, where they went, how they carried their world forward into the catastrophe that followed. These questions remain open, the human story behind the preserved town still unwritten. There is something in that image, the survivors moving away from the ash cloud, carrying what mattered most, that resonates across the ancient world. It is the image of a culture in transition, moving between what it was and what it would become, the knowledge of the old world packed carefully against the uncertainty of the new. The people we turn to now were also carriers of a different world, in a different hemisphere, 1,000 years later and half a continent away. But they understood with the same intensity that certain things were worth preserving, worth wrapping and sealing and placing carefully in the ground in the hope that whatever lay beyond death would receive them properly. In the mountains of northern Mongolia, in a remote river valley in the Noin-Ula range, a series of burial mounds rises from the steppe with the quiet authority of the very old. There are more than 200 of them, distributed across the landscape in a pattern that speaks to sustained use over an extended period. They are not the largest burial mounds in the steppe world. The great Scythian kurgans of the western steppes dwarf them in physical scale. But what they contain, and what the circumstances of their survival have revealed about the world that made them, places the Noin-Ula tombs among the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The tombs belong to the Xiongnu, the formidable nomadic confederation that dominated the Eurasian steppe from roughly the 3rd century BC through the 1st century AD, and whose relationship with the Han dynasty of China shaped the political history of Eastern Asia for generations. The Xiongnu are known primarily through Chinese sources, the records of the Han court, which track the movements and actions of its powerful northern neighbor with anxious attention. They are described as fierce, mobile, and militarily sophisticated, masters of mounted warfare, whose raids on the Chinese frontier prompted the construction and extension of the Great Wall as a defensive measure of last resort. What Chinese sources do not provide in any detail is a picture of Xiongnu inner life, their beliefs, their rituals, their understanding of death and what followed it. The written record of the Xiongnu themselves does not survive, if it existed at all in a form that could survive, and the picture assembled from Chinese accounts is inevitably shaped by the perspective and interests of the people writing it. The Noin-Ula tombs offer something different. They offer objects. The tombs were first systematically excavated by the Russian archaeologist Pyotr Kozlov beginning in 1924, in an expedition that operated under conditions of considerable political instability in the newly established Mongolian People's Republic. What Kozlov and his team found in the tomb chambers was extraordinary, not primarily because of gold or silver, though precious objects were present, but because of something far rarer in the archaeological record of the steppe world. Organic material. Preserved. The permafrost conditions of the Noin-Ula mountains, combined with the construction techniques used in the tomb chambers, had preserved fabrics, wood, leather, and plant material that would normally have vanished entirely from the archaeological record within decades of burial. What emerged from the tombs was a glimpse into a material world that the steppe environment almost never allows. A world of textiles, of decorated surfaces, of crafted objects whose delicacy and sophistication immediately challenge the image of the Xiongnu as purely martial and nomadic people with limited material culture. The textiles found at Noin-Ula are among the most discussed objects from the site. They include Chinese silk, expected, given the well-documented exchange of silk between the Han court and the Xiongnu elite as both tribute and diplomatic gift. But they also include fabrics of other origins, woven materials showing stylistic and technical characteristics that point to the Western steppe, to the Parthian world, to traditions of textile production far from the Mongolian steppe. The Xiongnu elite buried at Noin-Ula were connected to a world that stretched from China in the east to the Iranian plateau in the west, a network of exchange and contact whose breadth challenges the tendency to treat the Xiongnu as a bounded, isolated cultural entity. Among the most remarkable finds are the felt and wool carpets and hangings decorated with figural scenes, images of animals, mythological creatures, and what appear to be narrative or ceremonial episodes worked in fiber with a skill and complexity that speaks to a rich artistic tradition whose full extent the steppe environment has largely swallowed. The animal style that characterizes Xiongnu art, the intertwined predators, the dynamic confrontations between species, the way animal bodies twist and merge into each other across decorated surfaces, is visible here in 3 dimensions, in fiber and wool, in objects made to be used and seen and eventually placed in the earth with the dead. One particular hanging has attracted sustained scholarly attention. It depicts a scene involving human figures, a kneeling individual before a seated or standing figure of apparent authority, with animals and possibly supernatural beings occupying the surrounding space. The interpretation of the scene is contested. Some researchers have read it as a narrative, a specific mythological episode or historical event encoded in textile. Others have proposed a ritual reading, a depiction of ceremony, of the kind of formal interaction between human beings and divine or royal power that characterized Xiongnu court and religious practice. The figures' identities, the meaning of their postures, and the significance of the surrounding animals have not been agreed upon. The tombs themselves raise structural questions that have also not been fully resolved. The burial chambers at Noin-Ula were constructed as log chambers within the mound. Wooden rooms built underground with a craftsmanship that required significant timber resources in a landscape where large trees are not abundant. The investment of labor and material in the tomb construction speaks to the high status of those buried within, but the specifics of the burial ritual, what was done in the chamber before it was sealed, in what sequence, by whom, cannot be fully reconstructed from the surviving evidence. Evidence of deliberate flooding has been noted in several of the tomb chambers. Water appears to have entered some of the burial spaces after their construction in ways that may have been intentional. Whether this represents a ritual act, the deliberate introduction of water as part of the burial ceremony, or a natural consequence of the freeze-thaw cycle acting on the tomb structure, is a question that the evidence does not clearly resolve. There is also the matter of the human remains themselves. The Noin-Ula tombs were, in the assessments of the early excavators, partially disturbed, entered and robbed at some point in antiquity before the permafrost sealed the chambers and preserved their remaining contents. What was taken and by whom has not been determined. The surviving skeletal material has been analyzed, but the full picture of who was buried at Noin-Ula, their age, their health, their geographic origins, the precise nature of their relationship to the Xiongnu elite, has not been assembled with the completeness that more recently excavated sites have achieved. New excavations at Noin-Ula, conducted by Mongolian and international teams in the early 21st century, have produced additional finds and additional complications. The picture of the site continues to grow more complex rather than simpler. More objects, more evidence of the connectivity of the Xiongnu world, more questions about the specific ritual logic that organized the burial practice at this particular location. Why Noin-Ula? The valley is remote, not a center of Xiongnu political life as it is currently understood. Why were the elite buried here, in this particular mountain landscape, rather than closer to the centers of Xiongnu power? Was there something about this valley, its geography, its orientation, its relationship to the landscape of sacred significance in Xiongnu cosmology, that made it the right place for the highest status dead? The mountains of Noin-Ula kept what was placed in them. The permafrost held the fabrics, the wood, the decorated surfaces that the steppe world almost never preserves. 2,000 years of Mongolian winters sealed the chambers and saved what the excavators eventually found. What else is in those mounds? In the undisturbed chambers, in the tombs that Kozlov's team did not open, in the portions of the site that have not yet been systematically excavated. And what would a fully intact Xiongnu elite burial, undisturbed and completely preserved, tell us about a people whose inner world we have, so far, only glimpsed through the objects the permafrost was kind enough to keep?